Floodlamps and headlights, fenders and film stock, cameras and chrome. For almost as long as there have been movies, there have been cars. Hollywood and automobiles have grown up together, twin marvels of the technological age. Even in the ever-changing world of steering wheels and movie reels, the love affair between Hollywood and the great American hot rod has endured. From the dawn of the horseless carriage to the twilight of the 20th century, it's been a wild ride in some wild cars in a wild place called Hollywood. From Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills to the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, the culture of Los Angeles today is built around cars. In a town where image is everything, what you drive defines who you are. And just about everyone in Hollywood takes their wheels very seriously. For those who can afford it, having a car custom-made is the ultimate status symbol. From chrome to leather, pistons to paint job, every aspect is made to order. For the proud owner, the result is more than a car. It's a proclamation that says, I'm the hottest thing around, and anyone who thinks differently better pull off the road.
I think cars are sexy and like women.
I like how they look.
It's just in your blood.
I have a 47 International pickup. I have a 58 Cadillac.
These cars are so gorgeous. What fun it is.
But dream machines like these don't design themselves. Who do the stars turn to put their cars on the map? One man is George Barris.
George built my first car back in the early 50s. It was a 41 Ford.
He's done such marvelous things.
It takes a special artisan to do what George Barris does.
Working in his shop in LA's San Fernando Valley, George Barris is regarded by many as king of the customizers.
Creating the car is an important factor, designing it. Not only designing it, you have to design it to build it, to engineer it. It's not a fantasy world that you just can put it on a piece of paper and then it'll never happen. When I create something, it has to happen. It has to be real. It has to be something that you are really going to make it do what you want it to do. And the challenge to me is, did that automobile make a person happy?
Barris may have brought the custom car craze to new heights, but its origin dates back to the earliest days of the motion picture industry. Bursting onto the scene like circus clowns in an overcrowded paddy wagon, Mack Sennett's Keystone Cops heralded the start of what would become an ongoing love affair between automobiles and motion pictures. It was a match made in heaven. Early movie cars were used mostly as oversized props for slapstick comedy. Silent stars like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and Laurel and Hardy could do more with a fender, 4 wheels, and a nearby flatfoot than anyone could have imagined. Off-screen, Hollywood's romance with cars was more glamorous, especially during the Roaring 20s. Rudolph Valentino was often seen in the back of this French-built 1925 Avion Voisin. Across the nation, large, comfortable cars reflected the opulence of the times. Then came the Great Depression. For nearly a decade, America was off the road and stuck in a ditch. And the only hot cars, at least on screen, belonged to cold criminals.
Look, we've got company.
But in Hollywood, celebrities weren't hampered by the nation's money troubles. Carole Lombard, Jack Benny, Marlene Dietrich, many of the top stars had luxury automobiles made to order. The bigger the name, the better the car. When the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, America's long-stalled economy began to revive. The need for machine parts, munitions, and other goods spurred factories to increase production.
That's when the customizing really started to flourish. And then when all the guys went away to war, they're sitting in their barracks at night trading pictures of not only their girlfriends, but of their cars.
During the war, conservation efforts at home led to the increased practice of rebuilding and customizing cars. U.S. factories ceased auto production in order to provide Allied forces with manufactured goods. Young men learned to make the most of whatever spare parts and old chassis they could find. It was for a good cause, of course, but it was also a lot of fun.
The hot rod in the 40s was a necessity because you couldn't buy a car. So you got what you could and fixed it up. Well, the lane guys, they went out and got lane cars, but the top guys, they went out and got roadsters.
When the war ended in 1945, the entire nation celebrated the return of American GIs. Many of them came home with practical, hands-on experience in engineering and aerodynamic design.
My brother got out of the service and he joined me, and we both started into really customizing stronger.
I started doing body work and custom work at the same time, but most of my stuff started off in pinstriping. We made different designs on the car, down the sides of it and in the back end of it, and then we'd put some even flames on it and then put scallops on it, which was spears and things like that on it, and it kind of designed the car without doing custom work.
Hot rods went fast, customs attracted more girls. Could have more fun in the streets. With a hot rod, you couldn't have much fun because of the cramped quarters and the engine was always beating in your eardrums. But in a custom, it was nice and quiet in there and you heard the pipes out the back. It was a pretty mellow deal.
Customizers like George Barris, Dean Jeffries, and Ed Big Daddy Roth found themselves in great demand.
Cruising was part of the thing because at night then to show what we had done during the day, if we put a name on it or if we painted it or if we lowered it just a little bit more, we would go to the local drive-in and we would show off what we did. Well, everybody else then would copy it. If it was a good idea, they'd copy us. And then we knew we were successful.
I think the hot rod phenomenon started in California, and it was a combination of a number of things. One, the pure excitement of the speed. The second element was the fact that the car of choice was the Model A Ford. There were so many of them made, and they were inexpensive on the used car market. And the third was that it was a creative outlet for young guys. There were cars they had rebuilt themselves and were an extension of their ability to really show something in a creative way.
We used to have some great races. We'd all gather at a drive-in. The two kids that are going to race are about 2 miles up the highway. Oh, the thrill and the excitement. That guy would be up there with the flags to give them the start. And they'd go racing down, and the roar of the engines and the pipes and the skidding of the tires. Here these two guys are nudging one to the other. All the kids are screaming with music. And they knew whoever ended up last, they lost their car. What's the most dramatic racing scenes you've ever seen in your life?
To help spread the gospel, a young hot rodder named Robert Peterson created a publication dedicated to high-performance cars. The first issue of Hot Rod magazine hit the newsstands in 1948.
At that time, there really wasn't a voice or any kind of a way for the hot rod people to exchange ideas and to talk about the things they could be doing with their cars.
The guys in the East, they didn't know what we were doing because it was all a West Coast deal in those days. And they liked the race, but didn't know how to make the cars go fast. So when Bob Peterson printed Hot Rod magazine, that got back east. And of course, everybody then enjoyed the knowledge of what to do.
Soon everyone was jumping on the automotive bandwagon. With the help of new magazines like Carcraft and Rod and Custom, car designs were scrutinized by speed demons all across the country. And custom creations graced the cover of every motor magazine. Ever watchful of emerging trends, Hollywood took notice. Before long, movies were targeted at America's teen audience and the new hot rod culture.
I think there's always been a close connection between the car culture and motion picture culture, particularly in view of the fact that so much of the motion picture audience is young, and particularly young males. The second picture I made in the 1950s was called The Fast and the Furious, which was about sports car racing. And the key car there was a Jaguar XK120, and the lead heavies car was a Porsche. I have to admit, we didn't take the precautions with the fast cars that we do now. The fact of the matter is, my crew and I were young, and for the really fast stuff, we used to like to drive the cars ourselves because it was exciting and have somebody else stand behind the camera. I drove the car that was supposed to come in second, and a friend of mine drove the car that was supposed to come in first. As we came around the last turn, he was supposed to pass me. He didn't pass me, and I won the race, at which everybody started yelling and saying, "Roger, you forgot what you were doing. You drove to win." And I was saying, he just wasn't driving fast enough to pass me on the turn.
On screen, the boy next door was replaced by a bolder, more defiant persona. Actors like Marlon Brando embodied the rebellious spirit of America's first post-war generation.
What's the matter, Kathy? I was only trying to...
But teenage hot rodders still needed a hero of their own, a figurehead for their new, souped-up, fuel-injected culture. And then, along came a cool, brooding young actor by the name of James Dean.
He had that chemistry, that charisma that separates the good actor from the star. And I think the rebelliousness, the energy, the sexuality that he had appealed to young people. The very title of his greatest hit, Rebel Without a Cause, described Jimmy Dean, and it described a great portion of the teenage audience at that time.
You've won a few races, haven't you?
Oh, one or two. People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway. Well, Gig, I think I'd better take off.
Oh, wait a minute, Jimmy. One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine. You know?
A racing enthusiast, James Dean competed in several road races and owned a number of high-performance cars, including a red MG Special and a Porsche 356 Super Speedster convertible. In September 1955, he purchased a silver Porsche 550 Spyder.
James Dean's car was a little sporty car. It was a rear engine, aluminum body, very fast, but wasn't very stable. There was no real big steel around them to help them or nothing. There was a roll cage, and that was about the end of it. And they weren't very safe at all at that time. But it was a fast car, and that was the main thing.
But on September 30th, 1955, James Dean sustained a high-speed, head-on collision while en route to a road race in Salinas, California. He was killed instantly.
Of course, the news was absolutely shocking because we knew he was a good driver.
The hot rod era had suffered its greatest casualty. Once seemingly indestructible, James Dean was gone at the age of 24. He was now truly immortal, destined to remain forever young.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America is asking you to call.
Thanks to cheap gas, new interstate highways, and booming automobile production, Americans no longer had to stay at home. Almost overnight, the family car became a fixture of American life. Motor lodges and roadside diners sprang up all across the country. And if hungry passengers wanted to eat inside the car, well, that was no problem. There was drive-through. Every weekend, young men would have their cars washed, waxed, and ready to roll, all in the hope of impressing a female companion. There was no better way to show off than to arrive in a customized chariot with gleaming chrome and tuck-and-roll upholstery.
Young people wanted to get out of the house, and cars were one way to do it. And you could add to that the growth of suburbia, the great building of huge housing tracts outside the major cities, put an entire new audience outside the reach of the established movie theater.
Producers realized if cars were what Americans wanted, then that's what the movies would give them.
We were making pictures with leading men and leading ladies in their early 20s or late teens, and specifically putting them in fast cars with rock and roll music and with the culture they understood.
Girls Town was a movie that had it all. Fast cars, loose women, and rock and roll music.
Mel Torme is sensational as a hot rod hoodlum, just out for the kicks.
Oh, if either member of the team touches the steering wheel before the car crosses onto the bridge, that car loses.
It was a formula that couldn't miss.
Girlstown is the explosive drama of youth, racing down the road to nowhere.
But Hollywood left nothing to chance. To make sure these movies burned rubber at the box office, the studios turned to car customizers like George Barris.
The 50s was an inspiration for cars and the start of cars to become more like stars. Running Wild was one of the shows that we had a scene where Jan had to drive this Mercury, and it was a stick shift, and he couldn't drive a stick shift. And the only person that could drive the stick shift was Mamie Van Dorn.
I rode one of these cars in a movie I did for Universal called Running Wild. And it was a Carson chop top with a stick shift. I like to drive hot rods, I always have.
Mamie got in that car and she just started shifting and did the drive-through scenes just like a whip it. It was a lot of fun to see that.
You know what I mean, too. Don't tell me you never rode a hot rod or had a late date in the second balcony.
The lost generation, hardly. They don't care if they're the last generation. They want their kicks now.
The High School Confidential was another. We had chopped Mercuries built into this low driving car. Well, the car was so low to the ground that our stuntman had to jump a curb to roll the car over. And he'd hit that curb, he'd do everything. No way could he roll the car over because it was too low to the ground. We finally had to lift the car up with a crane and drop it down on its top.
Films like Hot Rod Girl, Hot Rod Rumble, and Hot Rod Gang celebrated the teens' autofixation, even as they exploited it.
The films my contemporaries and I were making were called exploitation films, and some of them objected to the word. It never bothered me.
But by glamorizing America's car craze, Hollywood helped fuel the country's obsession even further. Now movies and motor cars were truly interdependent.
The teenage audience was our primary target. We specifically tailored our movies to teenagers.
Drive-in theaters helped film exhibitors reach more moviegoers by combining cars and motion pictures. By 1960, new genres began to emerge from Hollywood, targeted at young, dating audiences. Especially popular were the surf and sand pictures. These innocent love stories combined rock and roll, the custom car craze, and America's seemingly endless summer vacation. Customizer Ed Big Daddy Roth's work with fiberglass during this time led to far-out creations like The Outlaw and The Beatnik Bandit.
The Outlaw I did design with a super cruise in mind. In other words, it was a nice-looking car, plus it would go fast.
Hollywood recognized the popularity of these new creations, and soon customizers were building innovative designs for the screen as well.
The Manta Ray was first used in a movie called Bikini Beach.
Bikini Beach. Bon Zipper's Rats.
You so big!
Versus the Beach Party Gang going drag strip.
Started off with an old Grand Prix Maserati back in the 40s, and I took the body off of it and took all the running gear out of it and took the motor out of it and everything, and then reshaped it and designed it out something different, and put the big Cobra motor in there, and one fender was one size and the other one's a little bigger. I was trying to design something that would be different, completely different, but still have some taste to it, you know?
I think the shift from the more action or violence-oriented teenage movie to the beach party movies was partially a reaction to some censorship, some criticism that some of the films we were making were a little bit too tough. So there was a movement of sort of just pretty girls on the beach and a lot of rock and roll music.
There's never been a beach ball like Beach Ball. They're racing in the Riverside Rally. And the sweetest little streamlined baby of them all, the Silhouette.
But the entertainment landscape was changing. Television was playing an ever-increasing role. And, as always, car customizers went where the action was. By the early 1960s, the spirit of technological innovation had overtaken the country. The future was now, and suddenly cars had features to suit every whim. It was a great time for car lovers. The atomic age had given us a new sense of purpose.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
And a new Cold War enemy to challenge our supremacy. As America entered the space age, car designs began to reflect the country's growing obsession with rocket ships, spy satellites, and high-tech gadgetry. Between the Cold War and hot cars, the 60s were a great time for Hollywood as well. Leading the free world in its Cold War crusade was British super spy James Bond. Agent 007 had audiences glued to their seats, especially when he got behind the wheel of what many consider the greatest movie car of all time, the Aston Martin DB5. Designed for the 1964 film Goldfinger, starring Sean Connery, the Aston Martin was much more than a sports car. It was a deadly, death-defying arsenal on wheels. Its features included front-mounted machine guns, revolving license plates, an ejector seat, and more. Bond's Aston Martin had raised the bar for car customizers. Studios clamored for more gears and gadgetry. From now on, car designs would have to go to extremes.
The 60s decade was probably the strongest influence on customizing cars.
In 1966, Barris was called upon to create a set of state-of-the-art wheels for what would soon become TV's top crime-fighting superhero, Batman.
Our crime-fighting things we had in those days were a little bit different than an electronic age that we have today.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger. Ready to move out.
We had 3 weeks to build that car and get out to the set. And I ran and got all my crew. We worked 24 hours a day. We actually built 5 Batmobiles.
Ironically, the vehicle used to create the indestructible Batmobile was far from new. It was, in fact, a modified Lincoln Futura, a prototype car first seen at auto shows in 1955. No one could have imagined what the future had in store for this space-age roadster. The basic shape of the Futura was left intact, but the rest of the car underwent radical modifications. The nose was restyled with a bat theme, hooded headlights, a peaked nose, and nostril-like hood scoops. On the rear, stock trim was removed and replaced with a stamped mesh grille that matched the front end. The fins were reshaped further for a cleaner, meaner look. And of course, the car was loaded with crime-fighting bat features, bat phones, laser, chain slicer, smoke screen, even a rocket launcher. The TV series developed a large and loyal following, so large that the studio decided to bring stars Adam West and Burt Ward to the big screen in 1966.
Emergency. Batman speaking. Warning all of you to brace yourselves for big news.
The biggest.
Tell them, Robin.
Holy superlatives, Batman. It's really exciting. Soon, very soon, Batman and I will be batapulting right out of your TV sets and onto your theater screens.
That's right, Robin. Our first full-length motion picture feature in color opens a whole new world of thrills.
Batman the movie pitted Gotham's Caped Crusaders against a cartel of the show's evilest villains.
During the filming, I would have to be on the set to work with our stuntmen, because in doing many of these different 360 turns, we had to have the car work according to what our script called for. So I would be there working with my crew along with their crews so that we can communicate to get these scenes as close as possible.
What's wrong, Batman?
Manifold pressure's dropping. I think we'd better stop and check.
Batman's dynamic dream car was coveted by friends and enemies alike.
Sorry about that, Commodore.
One arch-villain even managed to get behind the wheel.
Yo-ho! And away we go in my birdmobile. One sidekick, Crusader.
The Batmobile played a key role in Batman's enormous popularity. And when ABC announced plans in 1965 to create a series based on another comic book hero, the Green Hornet, they knew fans would be looking for a car to rival Barris's creation. This time, producers turned to renowned car customizer Dean Jeffries. His creation, a souped-up 1966 Chrysler Imperial known as the Black Beauty.
It was a car that had to have all kinds of mechanisms and things. They had some little ram things out in the front because they grabbed a hold of it and could flip the whole car upside down, and then you'd hide it underneath in a garage at their place. And inside there was kind of guns and places to hide guns, and all kinds of mechanical things would open up and you could push buttons from one end to the other. Front end opened up and rockets come out of it. Each week they'd add some more things and make something different out of it. So it was kind of a unique car.
The Green Hornet series was short-lived, but the Black Beauty won the admiration of TV fans and car lovers everywhere. Perhaps the strangest carriage of all was George Barris's design for the 1964 TV series, The Munsters, starring Fred Gwynne, Yvonne DiCarlo, Al Lewis, and Butch Patrick. Although Barris was given just 30 days to build it, the Munster coach was an impressive vehicle from any angle. Nearly 20 feet long and 7 feet high, its body was created by stretching a 1927 Model T to include an upright landau coach at center and a footman's seat in the rear.
We're going to show this camera to what happens with a Munster coach.
Painted in gloss black pearl with spider webs worked in, the coach was truly a vehicle to die for. And according to Herman Munster, the family car got 3 miles to each gallon of embalming fluid. But that was nothing compared to the Dragula, an out-of-this-world hot rod that appeared in the family's 1966 big screen feature, Munster Go Home.
See Herman Munster in his Dragula challenge some of the world's fastest cars in history's weirdest race.
Set in England, the movie pitted the ghoulish Americans against guest stars Terry Thomas and Hermione Gingold.
How is it?
Nice snug fit.
For auto enthusiasts and Barris admirers, the film offered a special treat, a scene in which the Munster men begin designing their hot rod on screen.
And look what I found. Some peachy headlights.
Oh, you know, we're going to have a terrific racer here. I used the motor out of our family car. I'm going to soup it up a little, stick in a high lift cam and a blower.
Boy, Dad, you're gonna wipe him at the race tomorrow. You're gonna shut them all down. Vroom, vroom, vroom.
What could you have for a ghoulish family like that than a real casket on wheels that would race? And it was kind of a great project because we had to build this casket, and I wanted a real casket. It was very hard to buy a casket because when I went in to buy one, they says, well, who's dead? I says, nobody's dead. We're going to do some filming. He says, you got to be dead before you can buy a casket from us. So the only way I could really get a casket is to actually slip some money into an envelope to one of the mortuary guys, and my 4 guys would carry a casket out the front door.
And they're off.
The Dragula sported a 289 cubic inch Mustang V8 engine with dual quad manifolds and high compression pistons. With over 300 horses at its disposal, this bat out of hell kicked up enough dust to raise the dead.
No, he's fighting the wheel, and there he goes. Over the finish line, backwards. In a beautiful display of driving skill, Lord Munster is the winner!
Barris's Munster cars were a high-performance blend of pop culture, car culture, and camp entertainment. And given the theme, it's safe to say the Dragula was one otherworldly creation. Responding to audience demand, Hollywood featured more and more custom cars in movies and television shows. Among the most impressive was the star vehicle of the 1966 film, Fireball 500.
Fireball 500. They're goers who stop at nothing.
The Fireball 500 was a Barracuda. We had a special front end on it by Plymouth. We put the big Hemi engine in it. We put dual cowl racing windshields and had flames, fireball flames coming down the side. It was color blends of candy apple reds and vibrant golds and yellows and whites.
It's 500 fireballs of action.
It was exciting because the scenes were exciting because racing in those days with those kind of cars was not high-tech racing. They were just balls out, go out and run your car around the track.
Intentionally built into many custom cars was a hip, offbeat sense of humor.
Out of Sight, about an undercover agent who uncovers a plot to wipe out way out music and tangles with spy girls from Flush.
For TV's zany musical group The Monkees, customizer Dean Jeffries designed this movable creation, modified from a 1966 Pontiac GTO convertible.
Well, the car was originally just made just strictly for the 4 Monkey kids, and it had a very unique paint job, you know, lipstick red type paint job, and the top, you could take it off to where you could have a convertible, old-fashioned looking type top on a modern body, so it's kind of different.
As the 1960s became more psychedelic, customizers were given greater latitude when it came to their visionary vehicles. But it didn't end there. Accustomed to driving stylish cars in the movies, celebrities wanted customized transportation off-screen too.
An interesting couple to work with was Sonny and Cher. We decided to make a his and hers Mustangs. So we made them 2 cars. So each one have had their own car, and we actually used the car for their first movie called Good Times. Many of the things that we did for the stars became a part of them, such as Zsa Zsa Gabor. She liked a beautiful Rolls Royce. One side was all gold makeup cabinet, gold combs, gold brushes. The other side had 2 gold wine goblets for her and her guest. And she was very involved. She would get in her coveralls and come down to the plant and actually join the guys in climbing in and out of her car that was all torn apart.
Between the beaches, the drive-ins, and the glamorous streets of Hollywood, Hot Wheels had seemingly been everywhere. Was there any road left for America's car culture to travel? Indeed, there was. Perhaps the biggest and most lucrative venue of them all. Merchandising.
There's a lot of TV shows and some movies that featured vehicles, really cool vehicles, such as the Monkey Mobile, the Black Beauty from Green Hornet, the Munsters coach, the Dragula from the Munsters. And they were very popular TV shows, and hence several manufacturers made replicas based on those vehicles, and they were hugely popular. I think the #1 seller was probably the Batmobile.
The car craze generated a goldmine in TV ad revenues. As the number of sets increased, manufacturers realized they could reach more buyers than ever before.
Well, I think almost everybody has a love of cars, and although you can't be Davy Jones from the Monkees, you can potentially own the actual Monkey Mobile. Even like Herman Munster, you can't be Herman Munster, but you can own a Herman Munster's coach or a Grandpa's Dragula. So I think a lot of people, they want something that they can't have, and hence, if you have a die-cast replica of something that is very cool, people want a piece of that movie, and you can own it for a mere $2 or $3. It's just a very popular thing to do.
But by the late 1960s, the public finally began to show signs of becoming road-weary. It had been a long, tumultuous decade, with the space race, the peace rallies, and the war in Vietnam. The 1960s had been a bumpy ride indeed. Having come so far so fast, America grew nostalgic for simpler times. Films like The Great Race and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang epitomized a new trend toward more wholesome family fare.
Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is a magical car, a craft that sails the seas, a flying machine that speeds through the air.
Ironically, the film's producer, Albert Broccoli, and the book's author, Ian Fleming, were the same men who had brought James Bond, Agent 007, to the silver screen less than a decade earlier. Things had come full circle. And then in 1969, The Love Bug took audiences on yet another wistful adventure.
Everyone has a fantastic story to tell about his car. Now, get lined up for the one that tops them all.
That little bug was really a love bug. But we had to do things with it. We had to tilt it up on 2 wheels. We had to make it jump. We had to have powerful looking scenes. And we actually had the love bug split apart. Then it would be able to fly up and come back down again. It was a performer.
Hollywood's new breed of cars were gentle souls with more heart than horsepower. They showed that winning wasn't half as important as just having fun. When astronaut Neil Armstrong walked on the moon on July 20th, 1969, it was as if the entire nation had crossed the finish line of a marathon spanning several decades.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
America had won the space race. And as the decade came to an end, the hot rod had become a relic of a bygone age. The 1970s saw a major shift in America's attitude toward itself and toward its cars. The idealism of the 1960s was replaced by a tough, hard-knock sensibility. Capturing that shift was the gritty 1971 film, The French Connection, which also brought one of the best car chase scenes ever to the screen. It was time to get down to business. Movie and TV cars no longer had to be laden with gadgetry. More important was a memorable, muscular style that reflected Hollywood's new, rugged, no-nonsense characters.
Name? Kowalski. Occupation, driver. Transporting a supercharged Dodge Challenger from Denver to San Francisco. Background, Medal of Honor in Vietnam. Former stock and bike racer. Former cop, dishonorably discharged. Now he uses speed to get himself up, to get himself gone. It's the maximum trip at maximum speed.
And in a twist of fate, car manufacturers began incorporating designs from the customizers.
Detroit was very interested in the designs that we were doing at that period of time. We were making aerodynamic cars. We were making ground effects packages and spoilers and air dams and scoops.
The move toward more muscular designs gained momentum around the country. But that didn't stop Hollywood from looking back upon hot rods with nostalgia.
American Graffiti.
In 1973, director George Lucas paid homage to the hot rod era with American Graffiti. The film was a celebration of California cruising and teenage innocence.
Grab that special one and jump into your candy-colored custom or your screaming machine, cruise downtown and catch American Graffiti.
To those who grew up in the 1950s, the film was a sweet reminder of a simpler time. To teenagers of the 70s, it was a fun look at an era they never knew.
Where were you in '62? Is that you in that beautiful car? Jeez, what a waste of machinery.
It's one of those great old movies about romance, racing, and rock and roll.
Starring Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, and Cindy Williams, American Graffiti was one of the year's biggest box office hits, leading to a revival of hot rod era nostalgia on TV in the mid-1970s.
A new cycle with the Fonz.
My bike made me the Fonz.
But America's renewed interest in the hot rod era soon ran out of gas, thanks to an oil embargo that sent fuel prices skyrocketing.
Yesterday, there were less than 40 stations open to serve about 5 million people.
So please help by doing your part, or else we may not have enough gas for any of us.
The 70s was a low-key period of time in the film industry because that's when the gas crunch came in. Everybody was looking to downsize their cars and get cars that were going to do 100 miles on a gallon of gas.
Even so, Hollywood producers who loved cars found a way to keep powerful engines on the big screen.
Cars have changed in relationship to the culture. First the hot rods, then the European sports cars, then the muscle cars, and the very, very powerful American cars that we had in a picture Ron Howard did for me, Grand Theft Auto.
I'm Ron Howard. This is Grand Theft Auto.
In the course of this calamitous chase to the chapel, Ron's caused the crashing of a $40,000 Rolls-Royce, 3 Cadillac, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, 7 cop cars, 4 trucks, a very cherry van, a lot of Lincolns, lowriders, 33 screaming street machines.
At that time, there was more emphasis on the sheer speed of the car and the stunts that the cars were doing.
Don't worry, they'll pull off.
They're gonna crash!
Corman's car crash movies became a deadly affair in the brutal cross-country car chase movie Death Race 2000.
Year 2000. America is a vast speedway. People line the streets to witness the greatest drivers on Earth in a race from sea to shining sea.
This is a death race.
I worked with a number of car customizers. Probably the best I worked with was Dean Jeffries, who did the cars for Death Race 2000, which became something of a cult picture.
Death Race 2000. Every car a deadly weapon. Every spectator a potential point.
It was a transcontinental race from New York to New Los Angeles, and the drivers were judged on 2 points. 1, how fast they could drive, and 2, how many pedestrians they could kill.
It's a cross-country road wreck, and the traffic is murder.
Roger Corman came and asked me to work on a movie called Death Race 2000. He had some small little drawings and stuff done and said, we need to build these cars and we need them now because we're going to get them going in a couple weeks. Started building one called a machine gun car, and one was a bull car, and they worked good. It worked out real good, and I guess Roger did quite well.
Those cars actually went on exhibit at a number of shows afterwards, and I ended up selling the cars to some car museum for more than they cost to make.
Hollywood's affair with cars seemed to be turning into a dark vision. But the descent into horror was to go even further. Classic cars became the very embodiment of evil. In 1977's The Car, an entire town is decimated by a Lincoln Mark III with a deadly disposition.
This car was indestructible.
Can't let him through no matter what.
We had to have one scene where this car had to roll over 5 times on a single highway in the Midwest with 2 police cars chasing it. And it had to end up on top of these 2 police cars. We put so much dynamite and black powder in this car, it blew the whole bottom out of this automobile. Put the stuntman into the hospital for about 30 days, but he come out of it all right, ready to do another rollover.
Fortunately, not all custom wheels were so vindictive, and these speed demons were soon laid to rest. But for the next few years, it seemed like Hollywood's affair with custom cars was over. Not until the economy rebounded in the 1980s were Americans ready to reopen their checkbooks for cars. But then, what a renaissance. Once again, the automobile was a status symbol. When the value of custom cars reached an all-time high, customizers like George Barris began to sell off their prized possessions. Countless movie cars made their way onto the auction block.
Now 100,000, now 101, now 101, 101, now 102, now 103.
Conspicuous consumption gave rise to many other high-priced toys, however, like the personal computer. And the new crop of teenage hotshots preferred a joystick over a stick shift. But Hollywood knew just how to jumpstart audience interest. Producers combined super-fast cars with state-of-the-art electronic technology. In 1982, NBC introduced Knight Rider, starring David Hasselhoff. The series' co-star was a computerized Trans Am that could talk, defend itself from attack, and burn up the road at 300 miles per hour.
Pow, we were right back again. Knight Rider, the talking automobile that could fly, it could do stunts.
I am the voice of Knight Industry 2000's microprocessor, KITT for easy reference, a kit if you prefer.
Here was every hot rodder's dream, a car that could think, talk, and back you up in a fight.
And the light would go back and forth, and the car would talk to you and tell you what direction to go with. And it became the starting of the electronic age for an automobile to become a big and important part.
When it came to custom cars, there was only one frontier left, and getting there was just a matter of time.
How far are you going?
About 30 years.
In 1985, Back to the Future took what was already the most outrageous car of that time, a DeLorean, and pushed it beyond the time barrier altogether. Michael J. Fox starred as a teen, literally driven back to the 1950s in a time machine built by an eccentric inventor played by Christopher Lloyd.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
With its stainless steel body, gull-wing doors, and a nuclear reactor in the back seat, here was the ultimate hot rod.
We started with 3 DeLoreans. We made a hero car,
a car for stunts, and a process car. And we took the designs of Ron Cobb and expedited that into the DeLorean time machine, which included the plutonium chamber, the flux capacitor, neon lighting all the way around, space-age fins that exhausted the cold, and tires and wheel wells that exhausted the fire, lights everywhere. The biggest joy creating the DeLorean time machine was working with the creative talents of Bob Zemeckis. He was very keen on the idea of it going out hot and then coming back into it cold. And that was one of our greatest challenges, the streaks of fire, and then, of course, when the car came back, to have it be completely frozen.
Freed from the limitations of real-world physics, digital special effects have changed the way Hollywood brings its hot cars to the silver screen.
Back in the 50s, there's only a few people that got into building special cars for the motion picture industry. There's very few. You can count them on your hand. Today, it's done with the computers and 9,000 people making different parts of a car, all a whole different world.
But to the movers and shakers of Hollywood, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
I think the basic psychology of cars in movies has not changed. It's still the speed, the machismo, the status, the sexuality of the car. We just finished shooting a TV series called Black Scorpion. During the day, she drives a white Corvette, and during the night, she drives the Black Scorpion mobile.
Activate auto transform.
The roar of an engine and the hum of a computer may be as different as night and day. But when Hollywood's car experts work together with computer technology, the resulting roadster can burn up the screen. Hollywood's Hot Wheels are still as hot as ever. And there are more ways to enjoy the thrill than ever before. The Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles showcases many classic and movie cars, all painstakingly restored and polished to perfection.
Every time I see a great-looking hot rod, it really thrills me. I get a big thrill out of it. We're having an exhibit right now where we're bringing the cars up from the basement. And we have all kinds of partly restored cars, partly beautiful cars. And we're showing the people how some of these cars start. When we find them, then we have to remanufacture them. We also are nurturing all sorts of collectors. There's people that have backyard garages full of cars. And so all of these people are wonderful to lend their cars to us.
The collectors who donate their vehicles to the Peterson Museum often started out with nothing but a dream. But famous film cars have inspired many autophiles around the country to create classics of their own. Their fascination began with teen movies like Hot Rod Gang and High School Confidential, but it has grown into a lifelong passion.
You might say I'm reliving my misspent youth. When I was 15, I never could get the car that I wanted. But now that I'm old enough, I can have whatever I want.
Customizing lets these weekend mechanics reinvent themselves in the likeness of their childhood heroes, icons who shaped their lives, even today.
My father was friends with George Barron since back in the 50s. So I said, "What do you think, George?" And he said that this was the Batmobile of the year 2000.
Modeling a car on perfection is one thing, but the ultimate thrill comes from owning perfection itself. An original TV or movie car. The Black Beauty used in the Green Hornet TV series was bought by a private collector and restored to mint condition.
This is the Black Beauty. This is the original car that was actually used in the TV show.
And you restored it yourself?
Yeah, I had it restored by the guy that did the TV show car originally, and he put this one back together for me.
As the value of these treasured vehicles continues to rise, it proves that true beauty only increases with age. Car lovers who can't buy a classic of their own can still share in the spirit of Hollywood's car magic. Collecting toy models is once again a popular pastime. Manufacturers like the Danbury Mint offer die-cast reproductions that can sell for hundreds of dollars. For toy car collectors, the market for these replicas grows bigger all the time. And for one car lover, it sparked a new career.
Being a fan of these toys in the 60s,
Hi, I'm Peter Wilson from the new film, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. The History Channel asked me to talk to you about comic book superheroes. Most things about superheroes aren't the way they appear at first glance. To some, this is merely kid stuff. But take a look behind the mask and you'll find something deeper going on. Superheroes have been dealing with serious personal, social, and political issues ever since the Great Depression. The real story behind superheroes is filled with as much drama and as many surprises as anything you'll find in the pages of a comic book.
In 1938, the first and greatest superhero of them all, Superman, leaped from the pages of Action Comics #1 into the imaginations of children everywhere.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Today, Superman has become a national icon, and that 10-cent comic could sell for over $300,000. But the Man of Steel nearly didn't get published. At first, only two people believed in him, his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
In 1931, there were two 17-year-old kids from Cleveland, Ohio, who were obsessed with science fiction.
Jerry Siegel wrote the stories, and his pal Joe Shuster illustrated them. The creations were never sold. Yet these poor Jewish kids dreamed that their sci-fi fantasies would someday bring them fame and fortune. In the 1930s, the big new trend in newspapers was the adventure comic strip.
There was quality in the writing, there was quality in the drawing, there was just a general air of capital Q quality associated with newspaper comics. That's what Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster wanted for themselves.
Siegel and Shuster's hero combined elements of everything they'd read, from comic strips to pulp magazines. He would be the last survivor of a dead planet, rocketed to Earth like a science fiction Moses, with the strength of Hercules, fighting for the common man, Superman. Many years later, Jerry Siegel wrote about his inspiration. He recalled, "I had crushes on girls who didn't care I existed, so it occurred to me, what if I was really terrific, jumping over buildings or throwing cars around?" Superman was sent to every newspaper syndicate in the country. They all said no.
I wrote back to them and told them this very patronizing letter that they weren't ready for prime time, that they should stay in Cleveland for another year until they developed their art style, because the art was quite crude. So much for my great editorial judgment.
Newspapers were saying no, but another new medium held out some promise: comic books. Selling on newsstands for a dime, comic books were originally just reprints of newspaper strips.
It was the cheapest way for newspaper publishers to repackage their comic strips. It was the video tape of its day.
Then in 1935, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, a pulp magazine writer turned comic publisher, had a revolutionary idea: comic books with all new, never-before-published material. But to make his idea work, the material had to come cheap.
The only people they could get to produce this content were guys that couldn't get work doing anything else because they were too young, or they were too inexperienced, or they were Jewish.
Siegel and Shuster fit the bill. Wheeler Nicholson's company, soon to be called DC, gave the pair steady work. In 1938, the company, under new ownership, took a chance with the strip everyone had rejected. Siegel and Shuster, both 23, finally saw Superman published in the first issue of DC's Action Comics.
Shuster cut up the panels, rearranged them in comic page form, and the golden age of comics began with the first issue of Action Comics.
Imagine how amazing it would be to open up that first issue. I'll never have anything approaching the level of a sense of wonder that those first kids that opened up Action #1 had way back in the day.
The first stories were crude but direct. Unlike most newspaper heroes, Superman lived in the same world as his readers. This wasn't medieval England or another planet. This was a city, a metropolis of lynch mobs and wife beaters, where politicians were crooks, where businessmen exploited workers and started wars in South America. It was the real world of 1938, a world in need of a hero.
The spirit of the people. He was up against corrupt landlords and vile dictators and bad generals and all that.
The New Deal, of course, was an effort to try to redirect people to look to a powerful force, the federal government, to serve as their benefactor, their protector against, local and greedy, corrupt interests. Comic book superheroes were super New Dealers, like costume versions of Franklin Roosevelt.
But what really made Superman revolutionary was his alter ego, Clark Kent.
Kent made Superman accessible, and in turn, he needed to be Kent to be human, to have access to us.
Superman comes from this other place to America. He can never go back there. It's been destroyed, very much as the Europe that especially the European Jews left behind was eventually destroyed. He is adopted by this ultimate American couple. He leaves behind the vaguely Hebraic-sounding Kal-El and becomes Clark Kent, the ultimate American. Even if you don't look at him as an allegory of the immigrant, he is an immigrant. He did come to America, and he did make good.
Superman's secret identity was an especially potent fantasy for the primary readers of comic books, boys. They were powerless like Clark Kent, but they dreamed that inside they were invincible heroes. Soon, it seemed like the whole country was caught up in the fantasy. There was a Superman radio show, along with motion picture cartoons, toys, and advertisements. His popularity in comic books even convinced a newspaper chain to turn him into a daily strip read by 20 million people. Meanwhile, each monthly issue of Action Comics with Superman sold nearly 1 million copies. Naturally, DC wanted another costumed character to match Superman's success. Bob Kane, a 22-year-old journeyman cartoonist, took up the challenge, along with 25-year-old writer Bill Finger. The Batman debuted in the 27th issue of Detective Comics. Unlike Superman, he had no superpowers, and there were other differences. While Superman fought for a liberal social agenda, the Batman fought crime, plain and simple. His story began when millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne, as a boy, witnessed the kind of street violence Depression-era readers knew all too well.
He saw his parents killed, and now he's obsessed with symbolically avenging those murders. It's perfect, and there's no way to elaborate. You say that, and you understand the character.
Batman is a fascinating character because he's so driven. Not the dude puts on, the outfit with funny ears and the cape and he goes beats the crap out of criminals. It's his thought process that's behind it.
Having the willpower to change his whole life and to balance being a spirit of vengeance and a spirit of justice, I think that's an immediately appealing concept.
In the early stories, Batman was described as a weird figure of the dark, an avenger of evil, just as scary as any mobster, monster, or mad doctor. Readers loved him. DC now had 2 incredibly popular superheroes who were about to have a whole lot of company.
Within a few years, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of costume superheroes with all kinds of varying powers.
With 2 very different superheroes raking in profits at the newsstands, it wasn't long before other publishers got into the comic book business. They knew what readers wanted: crime fighters with catchy names, and most importantly, costumes. That was a lesson cartoonist Will Eisner learned when he was developing a detective hero. One night, he got a phone call from his publisher, Busy Arnold.
I'm working on the drawing board, and the phone rings, and I could hear the jukebox going on. He was in a bar. He said, "Have you got a character yet?" I said, "Yeah, I've got this guy, a detective." He said, "Yeah, but does he have a costume?" So I'm sitting there, I was drawing the face, and I drew a mask on him. I said, "Well, he's got a mask." He says, "That's good, that's good." "What else?" I said, "Well, he wears gloves." "Oh," he says, "go with that." He says, "That's good." So anyway, that was how the Spirit got a costume.
By 1940, costumed superheroes were flooding the newsstands. At DC, Superman and Batman were joined by The Flash, Hawkman, Green Lantern, and more. Rival companies offered Catman, Bulletman, and scores of others. DC was the biggest comic book publisher, but there were more than a dozen competitors. One was Timely Comics, which would one day be known as Marvel.
DC Comics were certainly better drawn and better written, but the Timely books seemed to embrace more mavericks and wilder ideas.
Case in point, Bill Everett, the creator of Timely's antisocial amphibian, the Submariner, and Carl Burgos, creator of crime-fighting android, the Human Torch, wanted to have their characters meet in a gigantic slugfest.
Fire and water, the battle of the century.
Timely's publisher, Martin Goodman, heard their idea on a Thursday and told Burgos and Everett to have it on his desk by Monday.
So Bill and Carl called up everyone that they knew who was involved in comics for a kind of jam session. Pages were being drawn before they were written. One guy who turned the bathroom into his office put a board across his legs and wrote in the bathtub. People who were yelling out their ideas, arguing about which would be the best way to get the job done. The neighbors went crazy, called the cops. The phone was ringing off the hook, but by Monday morning, those dozen guys had completed a 60-page book.
The first generation of comic book creators were incredibly hardworking men. They had all grown up in lower working class environments, practically without exception. The Great Depression had an awful lot to do with the fertility of comics in all of those years. These guys were willing to work incredibly hard to make the stuff real.
One of the hard-working guys at Timely was a distant relative of the publisher, named Stanley Martin Lieber. Lieber would later be known by his pen name, Stan Lee, often called the father of modern comics. Lee started at Timely in 1939 as a teenaged assistant. Even then, Lee thought comic book superheroes should appeal to an older audience. Publisher Martin Goodman thought that was crazy.
I used to argue with him because I wanted to write things that were a little more adult for more intelligent readers. And he used to say to me, Stan, we have nobody but very young kids reading our books and a few illiterate adults.
Lee's boss wasn't alone in his opinion. Although newspaper strips were read by everybody, comic book publishers knew that their magazines were read almost exclusively by children.
Kids began reading comics as soon as they could read. It was the first purchase you made yourself, except for maybe a pack of gum or penny candy.
So instead of getting more mature, superheroes began changing to better reflect the juvenile market. To make Batman more appealing to kids, his creators transformed him from a weird avenger of evil into a father figure. They invented Dick Grayson, a young acrobat who, like Batman, sees his parents murdered. Batman takes the boy under his wing, and comics' first kid sidekick, Robin the Boy Wonder, is born. The theory was that young readers would identify with young heroes. And in fact, Batman's sales doubled after the introduction of Robin. Soon, there was an avalanche of sidekicks: the Human Torch and Toro, the Sandman and Sandy, Green Arrow and Speedy, Catman and Kitten, the Black Terror and Tim.
This idea of kid sidekicks, I hated it. The court would go after the guy for imperiling the safety of a minor, if nothing else.
While some readers did identify with the kid sidekicks, everybody identified with the superhero who was a kid in real life. Fawcett Publications' Captain Marvel. Created in 1940 by writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, Captain Marvel is actually a young boy named Billy Batson.
When he says that one magic word, Shazam, he becomes this big, beefy, strapping superhero. That's kind of the ultimate wish fulfillment aspect of the superhero, and I don't think it was ever expressed more purely than in that form.
Pure or not, Superman's publisher, DC Comics, felt that Captain Marvel's form, a black-haired, flying strong man with a cape, was a little too close to their man. They sued.
DC just felt threatened by Fawcett because Captain Marvel, for a while, was outselling Superman, and they kept at that lawsuit.
The legal battle lasted 12 years, until 1953, when Fawcett finally agreed to stop publishing Captain Marvel. Readers at the time weren't aware of the battle between Superman and Captain Marvel. To kids, there was room enough on the newsstands for both, and more. Superhero fantasies were a new way for readers to deal with the realities of the Depression. Now, an even bigger challenge would be just over the horizon. The superheroes would be going to war.
We were fighting Hitler before our government was fighting Hitler.
In 1939, the war in Europe had begun. Even though America wasn't involved yet, many superheroes were. By the end of the year, the Submariner began turning his general hatred of humanity against the Nazis in particular.
We just could all see what a menace Hitler was. It was more than what he was doing to the Jews. It was what he was doing to the whole world. He was gobbling up countries.
Superman's creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster thought the Man of Steel could stop the war in 2 pages. In a special story for Look magazine in February 1940, Superman simply grabs Hitler and his then ally Stalin and drops them off at the League of Nations. End of story, end of war.
In American society, we believe in instant solutions. Superheroes do that.
Superman's paper victory made its way to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who reportedly called Superman a Jew. The official SS newspaper mocked Siegel as physically and intellectually circumcised. Well before the U.S. entered the war, superheroes weren't just waving the flag, they were wearing it. Timely Comics had the greatest anti-Nazi of them all, who burst on the scene with an unforgettable cover.
Captain America threw a smashing right cross to the jaw of Adolf Hitler. That said everything about the character.
They got hate mail for that. They got hate mail from isolationists.
But most superhero fans didn't care.
Captain America exploded on the newsstand and sold out of his first issue.
The story begins as war is looming. FDR approves a secret project to create an army of super soldiers. Frail Steve Rogers is the first volunteer. The brilliant Professor Einstein injects him with a strange liquid. In seconds, Rogers is a perfect physical specimen, dubbed Captain America. When a Nazi spy kills the professor, the secret of the formula dies with him. So Captain America carries on alone, except for Army mascot turned kid sidekick, Bucky Barnes. Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who guided him through his first 10 issues.
Joe was a writer. Jack was always at that board, mumbling to himself, smoking a cigar, and drawing.
Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, will become one of the legends of the industry.
He was the Shakespeare or Cervantes, or take your pick, of comic books. He introduced a whole new level of motion into comic books, and that was revolutionary for the time. The page couldn't contain the degree of action.
Simon and Kirby occasionally mixed action with political prophecy. In the spring of 1941, Cap and Bucky stop an unnamed Asian power from destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet, 7 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked. When the Japanese actually did cripple that same fleet, Captain America's wrath echoed the nations. With war declared, the men in tights cast all restraint to the winds.
The superheroes went off to war with great gusto. Week after week, month after month, just pounding the hell out of the Nazis.
The stories had so much pro-American propaganda that you'd almost think they were subsidized by the government, but it was just, we felt we had to do that.
And then something very interesting happened, which was that comic books were included in care packages that were sent to soldiers, along with chocolate and cigarettes, and comic books became part of the standard reading material for GIs serving in the Second World War, and they liked them.
The superheroes were now in sync with the government's war effort. and comic book sales soared from 15 million a month in 1942 to 25 million a month a year later. World War II was the peak of what would be called the golden age of comics. And why not? In the comic books, the Americans always won.
The war in the comic books looked like something that was kind of fun. And the striking contrast between that and the war itself must have bothered some people.
The superheroes fought two kinds of Japanese, buck-toothed and fanged. But while the Japanese and Nazis were both portrayed as sadistic monsters, the Nazis' ultimate horror was never mentioned.
Certainly it was an opportunity to talk about the Holocaust, which everybody knew was beginning to happen. But nobody in comics would attempt it because I think essentially you felt that your audience wouldn't be interested in that. They wouldn't understand it.
There was a sort of irony in the fact that these characters, many of whom in that period in the Golden Age had been evolved to fight the Nazis, were themselves very much in the Nazi ideal. And the idea that you can solve problems through physical strength, by being stronger and more dominating, more powerful, that is fascism. I mean, that's it. That's the essence of fascism. And I don't think the creators of superheroes or the kids who were reading at the time were the slightest bit aware of it.
To one character, fascism was just another example of male aggression. But then, everything about Wonder Woman was different.
Wonder Woman was a particularly interesting character, created by a psychologist.
Charles Moulton was really Dr. William Moulton Marston, an author, one of the inventors of the lie detector, and an early defender of comics. The Harvard-educated Marston was hired by DC as a consultant.
The honcho hired him to think of a way to do a female Superman. Why not go after the girl audience? And Marston apparently decided to do it himself.
He came in probably as the first established writer to move into doing comics.
Marston began the saga in 1941. As a wounded intelligence officer, Steve Trevor crash lands on the island home of the immortal Amazons. The Queen's daughter, Princess Diana, falls in love with the helpless man. Her love makes her realize that the Amazons face the same decision other isolationists and pacifists face in 1941. Try to ignore the Nazis or fight for freedom. Against her mother's protests, Diana goes back with Steve to defend America, described by the goddess Athena as the last citadel of democracy and equal rights for women. Like Superman, Wonder Woman was more powerful than a locomotive, and she had better gadgets than Batman. An invisible plane, a telepathic tiara, a magic lasso that forced people to obey her, and bulletproof bracelets.
Wonder Woman was a great success. The female aspect was very heavily played. The artist H.G. Peter, however, had a very masculine approach. Artistically, it appealed to male readers.
Something else might have appealed to male readers. Wonder Woman lost her power and free will if men bound her bracelets together.
There was definitely an S&M quality about the appeal of Wonder Woman.
Almost every book was riddled with female domination, bondage, subjugation, punishment, and loads of fetishes.
Back then, I guess nobody got it.
Certainly, no readers at the time knew of Marston's unconventional home life. He lived happily with his wife and their children, and a former student who always wore metal bracelets on both wrists, and their children. Despite his avant-garde lifestyle, Marston had Wonder Woman give down-to-earth advice for kids on the home front, urging them to collect old paper and scrap metal, which could be recycled into war material for soldiers overseas. Other patriotic heroes also promoted collecting scrap or buying war bonds, and some even made financial sacrifices to do so.
Captain America requested kids not to send a dime for the membership card and the tin badge, but to spend a dime for war bonds. You know, every dime you spend may be the dime that puts a bullet in the last Jap in the war.
Here, Captain America's sidekick urges kids to collect scrap paper for the war effort. Little did he realize that request would turn comic books from 10-cent trash into eventual treasure.
World War II created the collector's market to some extent, because when they were looking for paper, the first thing that Mom wanted to throw out was those damn comic books. And so when you go and find a Golden Age book that's selling for $6,000, you can thank World War II for that.
At the time, none of the young artists or writers dreamed that their work would one day be so valuable. They were too busy cranking out stories or leaving the business altogether to go to war.
I felt I can't be writing about all these comic book heroes and not be fighting myself. When the artists and writers went off to war, the publishers had to give the strips to different artists and different writers, and the publishers began to feel that they were in charge of these characters. The characters became corporate characters, controlled more by the corporation.
The readers also seemed to want a little calm and stability after 16 years of depression and war. So the heroes began losing their edge.
By 1945, Batman was an establishment figure. He carried a platinum badge.
Superman went through a change as a sort of outside loner into the ultimate lawful authority.
Ironically, just as superheroes got blander, post-war politicians attacked them as threats to the very foundation of the country. In the 1950s, comic book superheroes would face their greatest battle, not against a mad scientist or a foreign army, but against the United States Senate. Comic books reached their greatest popularity in the early 50s. The paper rationing of the war years was no longer mandated. Nevertheless, average monthly sales climbed from 25 million in 1943 to almost 100 million in 1953. But if the industry was doing well, superheroes weren't. Readers were now more interested in other genres: funny animals, teen comedies, westerns, gangsters, and horror stories.
Superheroes were so closely tied in with, first of all, the culture of the New Deal and then the World War II culture, that they had trouble surviving.
When the war was over, the enemy was beaten. We didn't need superheroes anymore.
Not only had the GIs changed their tastes and grown more sophisticated, but the guys who were making the comics were tired of the same slugfest. The luster died, and the superhero died with it.
There were only three that endured, and that was Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman.
DC had faith in Wonder Woman's potential as a licensed property. Batman had already starred in 2 successful Saturday morning movie serials and guest starred on Superman's radio show. Superman, the first superhero, expanded his audience with tales of his youth in Smallville. Superman was a national symbol. In the early 40s, Superman's mission was defined one way.
Superman fights a never-ending battle for truth and justice.
By the 1950s and the introduction of the Superman television show, of course, it became
Truth, justice, and the American way.
That phrase, the American way, was all over the place in the 1950s, because now we're stuck in a Cold War.
But as Superman entered the 1950s, more popular than ever, his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were out of the business. A few years earlier, they had sued DC in an attempt to reclaim the rights to Superman and to get millions in royalties they said the company owed them. In 1948, they lost their suit, and DC let them go.
Jerry Siegel was essentially fired from the strip that he had created.
At least Siegel and Shuster were out of the line of fire when the comic book business came under attack.
A psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham suddenly got on a soapbox and began preaching against comic books.
Born in Munich, Wortham had been the senior psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital, as well as the director of a low-cost psychiatric clinic in Harlem. In the 1940s, he began conducting his own studies into abnormal behavior in young people.
He went around from prison to prison interviewing juvenile prisoners And one of the questions we asked him was, what do you read? Well, he discovered that all of them read comics. Ergo, comics are destroying our society.
I think he had a genuine concern for kids, which got out of control.
Wortham's assault on comics began in early 1948, and the anti-comic mood spread around the world.
Comic books were seen overseas as this virus of American culture and crime. Since they couldn't keep up with us militarily or economically anymore, they could at least try to fight against our culture.
In his 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, Wortham even attacked the Man of Steel, coining the term the Superman complex. Wortham defined the condition as fantasies of sadistic joy in seeing other people punished over and over again, while you yourself remain immune. Batman and Robin were like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Wonder Woman was the exact opposite of what girls are supposed to be.
He had the title Doctor in front of his name, and people listened to him. He was a good huckster, got a lot of publicity, and it almost destroyed the comic book business. And a lot of people were saying, good riddance, if that happened.
In 1954, U.S. Senators Estes Kefauver and Robert Hendrickson held hearings on the effects of popular culture on young minds.
They were kind of like a B-movie precursor to the Army McCarthy hearings, which were occurring at right about the same time. And they were both about equally ridiculous.
When the Senate committee's attention turned to the evils of comics, Dr. Wortham was the star witness, with testimony like, comic books are obscene glorifications of violence and crime. Today's children have been seduced by Superman. And Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry.
Every American saw us in this horrifically negative light. And then as an industry, we just bent over for the government.
Fearing government censorship, most of the major comic book publishers created the Comics Code Authority, a self-censoring organization that would issue seals of approval.
Everything that was published had to be sent first to this organization, and they had to put the seal of approval on it, indicating that the stories weren't too sexy, weren't too violent, and would in no way upset any young or older reader.
In their new code-approved stories, Superman worked closer than ever with lawful authorities. Batman and Robin spent more time with girls, and Wonder Woman hung out more with Steve. But superhero relationships stayed at the level of grade school crushes.
It instilled that belief in the American public that comics are strictly a kid's medium. I mean, we're still fighting against that stigma today.
The code also enforced rigid rules of conformity. About authority, it said, policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. About parents, it said, respect for parents, the moral code, and for honorable behavior shall be fostered. About ghoulish activity, it said, scenes dealing with Walking Dead, vampires, and werewolfism are prohibited. Many comic book publishers closed down. Many writers, artists, and werewolves fled the industry.
No respectable person wanted to be involved in that film. There are many, many, many stories of the comic book artists ending up in the alleys and basements of churches and ending up alcoholic.
And they did this right at the time when rock and roll was starting to break. That rebellious side of youth culture was becoming more pronounced in other media, and the comic book industry gave up that edge. They lost it, and in some ways they never quite recovered from that.
Between 1954 and 1956, comic book sales fell more than 50%. The industry would never again have the number of readers it had just before Dr. Wortham and the Senate hearings. The Comics Code placated enough of the public to save the industry. But what about the superheroes? Would they survive?
They were a dirty little secret that you read under the covers of your bed. They were the kind of thing that if your parents caught you reading them, you might get in trouble.
In 1961, the Eisenhower era was over. The new frontier was beginning. We were going to the moon. We were already in Vietnam. The comic books were still trying to recover from the impact of a government crackdown on the industry. Except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, most of DC's superheroes had been canceled by 1951. By the mid-50s, there were millions of kids who were unfamiliar with comic books.
By the late 50s, television was the medium of choice now for kids. The Comics Code had basically killed all the horror and crime comics, so they lost that edgy quality. So comic books went back to what had been their strength in the beginning, which was the superhero.
In 1956, editor Julius Schwartz oversaw the creation of The Flash, a sleek modern version of the fastest hero of the 40s. DC had found new success with science fiction updates of old characters: Green Lantern, Hawkman, and the Atom. Meanwhile, on a golf course in New York, comic book history was about to change forever.
My publisher, Martin Goodman, played golf with the publisher of DC Comics.
At least the legend is the publisher of DC Comics said, you know, we've actually had some luck with these superheroes. When
the new and old heroes joined forces as the Justice League of America, the series provided DC with a new successful title. While DC was on a roll, this was not the case at Martin Goodman's company, where writers and artists were churning out little morality tales featuring giant monsters, and they were tired of it.
I would make up a name like Gru or Mungor or anything that was a sound, and Jack would make a story out of it any way he wanted, and I'd put in the insipid copy.
Then Martin Goodman came back from his golf game with tales of the Justice League sales.
Stan, I want you to make up a group of heroes, because I think that's what's selling today.
Stan asked his wife Joan for advice.
She said, well, why don't you just once do a book the way you would like to do it instead of the way they want you to do it?
She's like, well, you're going to quit anyway. Just do it. Stan Lee took the problem to his sometime collaborator, Jack Kirby, and they came up with the Fantastic Four.
Inspired by the space race between America and Russia, 4 people who don't always get along try to beat the commies to the moon. Their rocket is bombarded by cosmic rays. The quartet crash land, and they've acquired superpowers. They team up, but they still don't always get along.
Mr. Fantastic would over-explain everything, the way I tend to do. The Thing would say, will you shut up, we got it already, and he and the Torch were always arguing and fighting.
The Thing hated being the Thing, and the idea of superheroes hating being a superhero was really a novelty. And it produced a lot of psychological richness, at least comparatively speaking, that had not been seen in comic books before. And so it was with the creation of the Fantastic Four that comic books really entered into the modern era.
Lee convinced Goodman to rename his company Marvel, after Goodman's very first comic book, which had featured the original Human Torch and the Submariner. Lee and Kirby had already created a new Human Torch, and in early 1962, they revived the Submariner. Lee gave Prince Namor a more noble speaking style and a new reason to hate mankind. He blamed atomic tests for wiping out his undersea capital. Also in 1962, Lee and Kirby unleashed another atomic-aged anti-hero, the Incredible Hulk.
Of course, in those days, there were so many movies with nuclear blasts creating monsters and giant things and so forth. So I said there was a gamma ray explosion, and he got caught in it, and it transformed him.
The Hulk was a metaphor for the early 60s fear that atomic weapons would get out of hand. While saving a teenager who's trespassed onto a gamma bomb test site, the bomb's inventor, Dr. Bruce Banner, becomes a victim of his own device.
It was Banner's dark side, just sort of, you know, metamorphosizing into flesh and blood. Green flesh and blood, of course, but there it was.
Whenever Dr. Banner changed, the army he worked for tried to kill him.
Even while the Vietnam War was going on, the Hulk's most persistent adversary was the U.S. Army. The Comics Code said that, you know, you couldn't show the Army as villains. And yet at the same time, Marvel was basically making them to be the bad guys. They're able to do this simply by saying the Army is trying to do what it thinks is best. It just happens to be a little misinformed in this case.
The Hulk looked like a menace. He looked like a monster.
There's nobody else who understood him except the teenager whose life he saved, Rick Jones. The teenager understands. But the world doesn't understand.
Characters like the Hulk struck a chord with a new generation of readers who were growing up questioning authority.
There is this character that when he loses his cool, he becomes this green monster, and he goes on tirades, and he just starts smashing things up. What better metaphor, could you have for angry youth?
We started to get fan mail, and the postmarks suddenly weren't from kindergartens, but they were from high schools, and then later from colleges.
If more readers were teenagers, Lee figured they might like a teenage hero. Lee's boss wasn't so sure.
You say that he's a teenager? A hero can only be an adult. Teenagers are sidekicks. And you say you want him to have problems. Stan, don't you know what a hero is?
It's interesting that in the 1930s, you had the country seemingly falling apart, and yet you had these superheroes come in that were totally confident in their ability to resolve these problems. And then in the Kennedy years, the early 60s, things seemed to be fairly stable, and yet you had the Marvel superheroes come in who were vulnerable and confused and disoriented. The difference was the baby boomers. They were notoriously self-absorbed. All this was magnified in popular culture geared towards youth. James Dean, for example, he may look tough on the outside, but his heart is breaking, and he wants to be accepted, and he's unsure, and his parents don't understand him, and the world doesn't understand him.
Peter Parker is a shy science major who lives with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. When a bite from a radioactive spider gives Peter spider-like powers, he doesn't even consider fighting crime. He goes into show business. But when he fails to stop a thief who later murders his uncle, Peter Parker learns that with great power, there must also come great responsibility.
People ask me where I came up with the line, with great power must also come great responsibility. And I have no idea.
Marvel Comics publisher Martin Goodman had so little faith in the idea, Spider-Man's first appearance in the summer of 1962 was in the last issue of a failed science fiction magazine. Then Goodman saw the sales figures.
He said, you know, Stan, you remember that Spider-Man character of yours that we both liked so much? Why don't we do a series about it?
Spider-Man went on to become Marvel's greatest success. Part of it was the art by Steve Ditko, who worked on Spider-Man till 1966.
After a while, he would give me the artwork for a 20-page story. I didn't know what it was, and I would put the dialogue balloons in because Steve told a story so beautifully that you almost didn't need the dialogue.
Part of the appeal is that before the spider bite, Peter Parker's life was a mess. After he gets superpowers, his life is an even bigger mess. Every teenage reader could identify with that.
It's not about that red and blue suit. It's about Peter Parker, the sick aunt, the girl problems, the school problems, the work problem. It's not just a suit jumping off the building. There's somebody inside of that suit that you care about.
DC heroes, like Superman and Batman, acted like the reader's parents. Marvel heroes often acted like the readers. To some extent, this was true even back in the 40s.
At that time, the worldview presented in DC comic books was a much simpler, easier to understand kind of worldview. Superman was good, Lex Luthor was evil. As I got older and, more sophisticated, 10, 11, then I started to look for greater degrees of ambiguity in my characters, and that meant that it was time to graduate to Marvel Comics.
DC was the old establishment company. Marvel was the upstart that led people to believe there was a rivalry, and there became a rivalry when Marvel started out selling DC. Then it became very real in terms of, good old bottom line.
One of Marvel's boldest moves came in 1964 when Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby brought back Captain America, Timely's World War II hero, whom Kirby had co-created. Readers were told that Captain America had been frozen in ice for 20 years, and shockingly, his kid sidekick Bucky had been killed in action. The infallible one-dimensional hero of World War II blamed himself for his partner's death. And in between fights, Captain America brooded like a star-spangled Hamlet.
He felt he didn't belong to our age. He was, as I say, an anachronism. He belonged back in the 40s. Jack hadn't done him that way, and I felt a little bit diffident mentioning it to him, but oh man, Jack loved the idea instantly.
Captain America's growing discomfort seemed to mirror the nation's, as the certainties of yesterday got turned upside down in a new age of rebellion.
We look at what Stan did back in the 60s, and we may say, oh, wow, I remember those stories really fondly, and they kind of read kind of quaint and kind of simplistic, you know, and maybe they were appealing to kids. Well, no. Back in the 60s, they didn't read that way. They were cutting edge. There was almost counterculture at the time.
There was a survey conducted by Esquire magazine in 1965 which revealed that self-described college radicals ranked Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk among their favorite revolutionary icons, right there with Bob Dylan and Che Guevara and Malcolm X.
There was a time in the 60s where comics were seen as very smart in the colleges of America, and Stan had his finger right on that pulse.
By 1968, Marvel was selling 55 million issues a year, matching or surpassing DC. And storytelling got positively psychedelic when a former magician and escape artist named Jim Steranko took over the spy strip Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
I brought surrealism to comics. I brought expressionism into comics. I brought pop art and op art, optical effects, into comics.
Steranko probably had more effect on the comic industry with fewer comics than anyone in history.
There was this whole cult of personality created around Steranko. You know, you didn't hear his first name, it was just Steranko. And he was very aloof, and, you know, the pictures you saw of him were grainy and blurry, and, you know, it's just this whole mystique around Steranko.
Steranko was the first rock star artist in comics. Like a rock star, he pushed the boundaries of what the comics code found acceptable in the late 60s.
They used to take the cleavage line out of my girls.
Some changes were truly bizarre. In one silent sequence between Fury and his lady friend, a fully clothed embrace was deleted and replaced with a blow-up from the first panel of Fury's gun.
This huge pistol shoved into the confines of a shoulder holster was much more suggestive than anything I had on that page.
But just as Marvel was pushing the boundaries with S.H.I.E.L.D. and black superheroes like the Black Panther, and cosmic philosophers like the Silver Surfer, one of the oldest superheroes got a new lease on life. In 1966, DC's Batman came to television. The show was a campy take on the Caped Crusader, and soon Batmania swept the nation. Even the Batman comic books, which had been losing readers after years of mediocre stories, doubled in circulation, selling almost 900,000 copies a month.
On the one hand, it sparked a huge upsurge in the popularity of superheroes. On the other hand, the resurgence in interest in comic books had been based largely on taking these characters seriously. You talk to people even today, I mean, bring up the topic of superheroes, and they say, oh, you know, biff, bam, pow, and ridiculous.
The joke soon wore thin. By 1969, the show was off the air and Batman's comic sales fell almost 60%. To the general public, superheroes were once more seen as kid stuff, and the country was getting too serious for that.
We were teetering between the Vietnam anti-war rebellion and the Watergate years. The whole social structure was beginning to open to criticism for the first time.
The superhero revival of the 50s was colliding with the counterculture. To hold on to their readers, especially their college-age readers, superheroes would have to get with it. DC wanted to update Wonder Woman for 1968. Writer and artist Mike Sekowsky started the process, and later journalist-turned-comic writer Denny O'Neil was brought in to continue Wonder Woman's transformation to 60s hit. It wasn't easy, as O'Neil found out.
When you get a job like that, implicit in it is shake it up, do something new.
DC took away Wonder Woman's costume and powers and had her learn karate. It was hoped that a more realistic Wonder Woman would be embraced by the new woman's lib movement. But feminist leaders like Gloria Steinem, who'd grown up with the original version, hated the changes.
They said that I had taken the only powerful woman in comics and had taken her power away from her. It is now many years later, and I absolutely see what they were talking about.
After 4 years of karate kicks, DC agreed with Gloria Steinem and gave Wonder Woman back powers and her costume.
So, not one of the more glorious chapters in my comic book career.
O'Neill had better luck with another legend whose sales were slipping, Batman. DC editor Julius Schwartz wanted to erase the stain of the campy TV show and get back to the 1939 roots of the character.
As a loner who never showed his face in the light, was the way I remembered those early Bill Finger, Bob Kane stories.
Schwartz teamed O'Neill with artist Neil Adams, who brought a dynamic new realism to superheroes.
Neil once said if superheroes existed, they would have to look the way I draw them, and I think that's absolutely right.
The Batman of the late 60s and early 70s was a fearsome creature of the night for the first time in 30 years. O'Neill and Adams had saved the character from the clutches of camp, but their next resurrection job would involve more than stylistic change. O'Neill and Adams were about to bring social commentary to comics in a radical new way. DC editor Julius Schwartz thought putting more messages in the adventures of Green Lantern might save the book from cancellation.
So let's try it. Let's see if we can start using as a springboard what's happening in the newspapers.
Green Lantern was a hero with a lot of power but no personality. A test pilot inducted in a cosmic police force. He used his power ring to fight supervillains and creatures from outer space.
I had thought of Green Lantern as an enforcer of the status quo. So we needed a contrast with that. Green Arrow is a character dating back to the 40s, never had his own title, had appeared in anthology books, and was kind of a Batman with a bow and arrow. But he was really bland, so we made him the voice of the streets, the voice of the left.
In early 1970, Green Lantern Green Arrow number 76 hit newsstands like a Molotov cocktail. It was openly liberal, even radical. Green Arrow tells readers that a moral cancer is rotting America's soul. The well-meaning Green Lantern is accused of being a racist.
What I remember putting in the script was asking Neil to draw the best face he had ever drawn of a black guy who had been through hell. And he did it. And he starts to say something about, well, I hear you've been helping the blue skins and the green skins on these other planets.
You've done a lot for the purple skins. What have you done for the black skins? It's one of the most reprinted panels in comics history. When you look back at it, well, what's so radical about this? But at the time, it was an outrageous proposition.
My theory was that it was probably too late for my generation. But maybe you get a real smart 12-year-old and get him thinking about racism.
Green Lantern Green Arrow was self-consciously relevant. It tackled religion, race, pollution, and Native American rights. But there were some things that even relevant comics steered clear of. One, incredibly, was the major news story of the time, Vietnam. In the early 60s, some characters were featured in Vietnam-themed storylines. But when the war and the protests at home were raging in the late 60s and early 70s, Vietnam was generally avoided.
I think that generally there was a feeling that that was a scary topic.
Letters would come in from fans saying, hey, how come Captain America doesn't go to Vietnam, like and fight the commies there, and like he did the Nazis in World War II?
Marvel heroes had fought the commies in the early 60s, but by the end of the decade, Cold War attitudes didn't seem relevant.
After a while, I think we weren't that sure that the communists were the greatest evil in the world. I tried to avoid stories about the war. The Vietnam War, to me, was too tragic a thing.
By the time we got the courage to do material about Vietnam, I think the war was pretty much over.
The other untouched issue of the period was drugs, until, ironically, the Nixon administration forced the issue in 1971.
I had received a letter from the government, from the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare. They thought it would really be beneficial if I would get a story about the dangers of drug addiction and featured in one of our top books.
Lee and artists Gil Kane and John Romita worked out a 3-issue story arc in which Spider-Man fought the Green Goblin. In a subplot, Spider-Man saves an inner-city kid so stoned he thinks he can fly.
I know nothing about drugs, so I didn't mention what he overdosed on. I didn't know.
Later, Spider-Man's friend Harry, the Green Goblin's son, gets hooked on pills and suffers a near-fatal overdose.
The reader didn't feel we were giving him a lecture. It was just an incident in a story, which I feel is the best way to do it.
Only one problem. The Comic Code Authority didn't want Lee to do it at all.
Rejected. We could not put the seal of approval on those issues. I said, why? They said, according to the code, you're not allowed to mention drugs. I said, but we're not telling the kids to take drugs. The whole purpose of this is to show the danger of drug addiction. Doesn't matter, you're not allowed to mention drugs.
At an impasse, Lee turned to his publisher, Martin Goodman, for support.
I said, Martin, I want to do these books anyway, so we won't have the seal of approval. I was so proud of him. He backed me to the hilt. He said, absolutely, Stan, just let's send him out.
For 3 months, Marvel published Spider-Man without the code's approval.
The world didn't end, the sky didn't fall. We had the greatest write-ups.
My father came home and he said, you know, you have to go pick up this thing called Spider-Man. I'm like, why? Of course, what he didn't realize at the time was that he started a whole new addiction, which was comic books. So, you know, coincidentally, I never used drugs, but boy, I collected comic books like crazy.
Thanks to the controversy, the Comics Code was liberalized. A few months later, when DC published a much stronger drug story, with Green Arrow's former kid sidekick Speedy as an out-and-out heroin addict, it not only got the seal of approval, but New York Mayor John Lindsay wrote a letter of commendation. But good intentions didn't translate into sales. 2 issues later, Green Lantern Green Arrow was canceled. Relevancy had run its course. But when it came to the first superhero, his durability was proven once again. Over the years, many different writers and artists had redefined Superman. The character had survived because he could be reinterpreted to reflect the times. The 1978 motion picture starring Christopher Reeve kept the basics of the legend and added a late 70s edge of sex and romance.
First Superman is wonderful. It's a really great origin story. If you like the comics, I think Part 2 appeals to you even more because, you know, he's fighting superpowered villains.
3 years before Superman the movie hit theaters, the project would prove to be a milestone for Superman's creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. In the 1940s, they had sued DC over royalties and the rights to Superman, and lost. Now, artist Neil Adams took up their cause. Using the publicity surrounding the upcoming movie, he pressured DC to make amends. In 1975, Siegel and Shuster got a modest lifetime pension and a restored byline on Superman. But DC kept the rights. The first 2 Superman movies were huge box office successes, and Superman's value as a licensed product was reconfirmed. But he was no longer the most popular hero in comic books. Readers' tastes were once again changing, or perhaps mutating. The new hot heroes, the X-Men, didn't always deal with specific political issues, but they were relevant in a broader sense.
The X-Men are very relevant because above and beyond everything else, it's a story of bigotry, of these people who are hated because they're different, even though they're good. And they're trying to help the world. I mean, there's almost a little bit of a Jesus Christ feeling in there.
The X-Men are sort of the most consciously, deliberately, and successfully metaphorical of any comic book superhero.
The X-Men are a team of teenage mutants, each born with a superpower that manifests around puberty.
More mutants are starting to get born. The fear grows even more amongst normal human beings that they will take over the earth.
Growing up in Israel, I understood the metaphor. It was about the right to live and the right to exist.
If you're African American growing up reading comic books, you could relate to the X-Men. If you were gay growing up reading comic books, you could relate to the X-Men. If you were merely just a geek, a nerd being picked on, you could relate to the X-Men. The idea of being simultaneously special and persecuted is a very potent, powerful one.
The X-Men were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963, but never really took off until the late 70s, with stories by Chris Claremont, art by Dave Cockrum and John Byrne, and New Mutants like Storm, and especially Wolverine.
He's got that whole bad boy thing going on. It's James Dean, sort of Clint Eastwood kind of attitude to him.
Wolverine was the kind of character you could not have had in the 1960s because he was very much a reflection of that cynicism and sense of irony that came out of the 60s, that came out of Vietnam and Watergate. Wolverine was a superhero for Generation X. He wasn't afraid to take it to the bad guys exactly the way they would take it to you, or worse.
I know as kids we were always fascinated by Wolverine's adamantium claws. But it was just the idea of having a weapon so handy all the time, never having to reach for it, just, snap.
Wolverine, in many ways, was the precursor to a darker hero. In the early 1980s, a new breed of creatures would take rough justice to new levels.
It was really up to people of my generation to basically get Batman his balls back.
In the closing years of the Cold War, inflation was high. The potential for global destruction was ever present. And the comic book industry was trying to find its place in the world.
I think all those things balanced together to a questioning of which way is the world going? And that reflected itself in the superheroes.
We couldn't accept a goody-goody coming down and doing things just because they were good. But we could accept somebody who felt some twisted emotional need to fight evil. And we could accept it with violence, and we could accept it with irony.
Which is what writer-artist Frank Miller wanted to give readers.
My mother says that I was somewhere around 6 years old when I walked into the kitchen and held up a bunch of sheets of typing paper I'd folded in half and stapled in the middle and said, "This is what I'm doing for the rest of my life."
Miller got his big break in 1979, when, at the age of 22, he took over one of Marvel's second-string titles, Daredevil.
I was very hungry to do it because it was my chance to do a crime comic, just having to be in red tights.
Daredevil was a Stan Lee, Bill Everett creation from the 1960s. By day, Matt Murdock is a New York defense attorney. By night, he's a vigilante with unique powers and problems.
The dude's blind, but all his other senses are heightened. So right then and there, you're like, this is one of the most implausible comic book characters on the planet. Blind guy flipping off roofs and whatnot, dressed like he's dressed. But Miller brought this really wonderful humanity to it, and the humanity came from this place of Daredevil being so flawed, just being kind of broken.
I figured Daredevil had to be a Catholic, because only a Catholic could be a vigilante and an attorney at the same time.
Miller turned Daredevil's sweet blonde girlfriend into a drug addict. And created a new love interest for Daredevil, Elektra, Matt Murdock's college girlfriend, now an assassin for hire.
And I stole one of Will Eisner's best spirit stories of a character called Sans Serif. And stole it structurally top to bottom, But I make no excuses. He knows it, and I told him.
It was always slightly in contempt of the nice girl next door your mother was always introducing it to. It was a slut down the street that was really interesting.
When Miller killed Elektra after 14 issues, fans were shocked, but admired the artistic guts it took to kill such a popular character. Later, Marvel brought her back to life. Some characters are just too good or too good-looking to stay dead. Miller challenged the traditional superhero notion of non-lethal justice when he revived a 1970s vigilante called the Punisher. After the Mafia guns down his family, ex-Marine Frank Castle wages a one-man war against crime and actually kills people. This was a little too strong for the 70s, but fit the 80s like a .44 bullet in a magnum chamber. To Daredevil, the Punisher was a villain, but readers loved him, and a host of writers and artists tried to meet the demand.
People voted for Reagan because he kicked butt, because he came on as a tough guy. And I think that attitude was mirrored in superheroes of the 80s. It's not to say the people who wrote The Punisher believed that, but I think they did tap into a popular mood.
Then came the British. Same edge, different slant. More European, more political. Writer Alan Moore and artist Dave Gibbons created a 12-issue miniseries for DC in 1985 called The Watchmen.
Alan Moore said he was really out to kind of destroy the whole notion of not just superheroes, but heroes in general, because these are people that you trust with your lives, and nobody should do that. You really needed to trust yourself.
In the alternate universe of The Watchmen, superheroes are morally ambivalent, impotent, or psychotic. One of them ends the Cold War by faking an alien invasion that unites the world and kills 3 million New Yorkers in the process.
Alan created this story commenting on superheroes, talking about superheroes, what they meant, and also talking about how it felt to be out on the streets in 1985 with Russia versus America, feeling like the nuclear clock was clicking closer and closer.
Watchmen was the most complex and intricate superhero story ever produced. It inspired a generation of artists and writers.
Most of the guys in comics lived within about 50 miles of here. So we were all at the same poker games and the same parties, and it's just, wow, how the hell did he do that? And you went home and you ripped up whatever you had done that week and just said, no, damn it, there's more I can do.
Even Frank Miller felt he could do more. His next project, a 4-issue fantasy of the future, The Dark Knight Returns. It pits an aging Batman against psychotic foes and a corrupt society.
I just wanted to do this older Batman and to make him really nasty. I thought, what better way to make him a badass than have him be the Dirty Harry out there, the guy that nobody likes.
For Miller's Batman, the biggest problem isn't the Joker, but Superman, a well-meaning Boy Scout in thrall to Ronald Reagan, conducting one-man secret wars in Central America. Superman and Batman had been friends since 1940, but weren't after 1986.
I'll gleefully take credit for breaking up the Batman-Superman friendship. Bruce has been one who enforces order in the world and believes that entropy is the natural state of existence, whereas Superman believes that order is the norm. These two people would not like each other. They just wouldn't.
We felt at the time like every Batman story that could have been told had already been told. And suddenly, here's Frank.
In the mainstream media, it got a great deal of attention, positive and negative, mostly positive. Within the comics industry, it seemed to be closest thing to a bar fight anybody could have asked for, in that it was quite controversial. That I actually got called up by former Batman writers saying I had ruined their character.
Dark Knight has been accused of being a pro-fascist vision. I mean, that doesn't make it any less interesting as a work of art, nor does it say particularly that that's the side that Frank comes down on.
I think my stuff's kind of jolly, but that's just me.
The Watchmen and Batman, The Dark Knight Returns. There were two watershed books of that period. I think it was a good thing and a bad thing. I think that even though those works are both brilliant works, the traditional innocence of superheroes went out of the market at that point.
In the grim and gritty era, old characters were given new problems. Child abuse, a daring new topic in the 1980s, was revealed as the cause of the Hulk's anger. His father had beat him and his mother. Other heroes developed severe drinking problems. One of the biggest changes of all happened to Superman's arch-enemy. For 45 years, Lex Luthor had been a mad scientist. That had no longer been grim and gritty enough. So he was transformed into the most evil thing on Earth, a 1980s businessman.
Lex Luthor's transformation reflected another concern about Reagan's America, which is the real source of evil was once again, like in the 1930s, corporate America.
But maybe comics' darkest moment came when DC decided to kill Robin. Not the original boy wonder, Dick Grayson. He'd been allowed to grow up, go to college, and become a character called Nightwing. This was a new Robin named Jason Todd, a replacement sidekick whom many people hated.
You hear about characters taking on a life of their own. Jason was the best example of that I've ever personally encountered. Nobody set out to make him an obnoxious little snot, but he kind of was that.
In 1988, Batman's crazed, white-faced foe, the Joker, captured Jason, beat him to a pulp, and set off an explosion. DC left his fate up to the readers.
If they dialed the 1-900 number, he survived the explosion. If they dialed the other, the kid didn't make it. And we waited.
DC received 10,614 calls. The verdict, death, by 72 votes. When the mainstream press got wind of this, they were outraged.
I think most people thought it was Dick Grayson. People had an emotional investment in Robin, even if they hadn't seen a comic book in 20 years. I used to have a little Batman symbol on my jacket lapel. I went into a Fifth Avenue deli to buy a tuna fish sandwich, and the guy looked at that and asked who I was, and I said, I edit Batman. He said, hey, this is the guy that killed Robin!
Batman later found a third Robin, a nice kid named Tim Drake, whom fans did accept. But the death of Jason Todd continues to haunt Batman and Denny O'Neil.
I thought I was a guy writing and editing fiction. I realized that no, the Batman editor and the Superman editor are more than that. We are the custodians of folklore.
The 1980s ended with the release of Tim Burton's movie, Batman. The film seemed to signal a new era for superheroes. But just ahead, there would be big trouble.
The sad, horrible, pitiable collector's bubble, which came very close, I think, to wiping out comics for a second time.
By the late 1970s, the average comic book cost 40 cents. This was too much for some young readers, but not enough for most newsstand dealers. Comic book publishers needed a new outlet for their product. They found it in the growing number of stores that were selling old comic books as collector's items.
If we've got these comic shops selling used comics and back issues, we should be able to get them the new comics. That would be cool.
The superheroes moved off the newsstands and into several thousand stores scattered across the country. These stores became like private clubs, catering to a hardcore base of comic book fans.
The den-like atmosphere of most comic book stores is straight out of comics. It's very Batcave-like. It's a kind of self-defense mechanism. We walk into a comic book store and it's kind of dark and dingy because they don't want outsiders coming in and being like, what's this? This is silly.
The comic book changed from being a mass market product to a specialty item, sold at higher prices and marketed to older readers.
There's still a small group of people who react to say, but comics are for children. We point out with some passion and energy that comics not only aren't only for kids, they're not mostly for kids today.
One of the most successful and critically praised mature series was Sandman from DC's new Vertigo imprint. It was written by Neil Gaiman, who'd grown up in England with reprints of American comics.
Reading comics for me, it was like getting postcards from Oz.
DC's first Sandman in 1939 fought crooks with a gas mask and a gas gun, then with tights and a sidekick. A second Sandman in 1974 was a superhero master of dreams. Gaiman used bits of both in Morpheus, the godlike lord of the dreaming, a very different superhero.
The idea of putting somebody in a costume seemed very odd. I thought, I don't know any people who wear costumes. On the other hand, having somebody who dressed all in black, it seemed kind of obvious to me. Whatever was going through my head, month to month, it went straight into Sandman. I could do anything, from stories set in Roman times, all the way to the Iraq War and the ruins of Baghdad.
Sandman number 19, based on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was the first comic to win a World Fantasy Award. not in a special comic book category, but as Best Short Story. Previous awards had gone to noted authors like Harlan Ellison and Jorge Luis Borges. Some on the committee felt that a comic book didn't belong in such company.
We got the award on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday morning, they changed the rules to make sure it could never happen again. It was more than closing the stable door after the horse had gone. It was more like closing the stable door after the horse had gotten out and won the Kentucky Derby.
At least Gaiman still got respect at DC, where he had complete creative freedom. Almost.
When I wrote the Serial Killers Convention episode of Sandman, I had a reference in it to masturbation, and a message came down: people do not masturbate in the DC universe.
Over the next decade, comics, like movies and TV, would experience a sexual revolution.
In the 1990s, comic books began to take on issues, explore issues that they never would have come close to before, like homosexuality.
Gay and lesbian characters would proliferate. In The Authority, Apollo and Midnighter are violent crime fighters and tender lovers. In the early 1990s, comics were making a lot of money, and not only publishers. Unlike their predecessors, writers and artists could now own the characters they created. And if a new superhero hit big, its creator could make a lot of money, like Todd McFarlane. McFarlane had made his name as an artist and writer on Spider-Man. In 1992, he and a few other popular artists formed Image, a creator-owned company that challenged the big two of Marvel and DC with comics like Spawn. When Al Simmons, an African-American assassin for the U.S. government, is murdered, he comes back as a Hellspawn with superpowers from the devil. He battles heaven, hell, and human evil, all the while trying to get used to the idea that his wife is now his widow and married to his best friend. Spawn #1 sold 1.7 million copies and led to an animated series on HBO, a live-action movie, and a line of toys.
There was a point in the early 90s where comic book creators, writers, artists, publishers were all becoming millionaires.
Because comics were now sold in specialty shops, it was easier for publishers to put out one-shot issues that weren't necessarily part of the hero's regular storylines. These were called graphic novels, which sounded more impressive than comic books. Occasionally, the stories were openly political. By the early 1990s, some politicians saw these graphic novels as a way of embracing or promoting controversial issues. A 1993 anti-handgun story from DC had politicians rallying around Batman to help raise awareness for stricter gun laws.
Batman was a more logical character than Superman because Batman's parents were killed by a gun.
Virginia Governor Doug Wilder showed seduction of the gun to state legislators as an example of why a stringent handgun law was needed. The law passed, and the governor invited writer John Ostrander and editor Denny O'Neil to the signing ceremony. A few years later, in 1996, comic books were used to raise awareness about the dangers of unexploded landmines. DC produced a special Superman comic that could be distributed to children in Bosnia. The issue warned children to steer clear of undetonated landmines.
We were told by people over there, who we met later, that they really feel we saved some lives.
Batman also joined the campaign with a special issue Denny O'Neil wrote called Batman, Death of Innocence.
Batman is trying to save a little girl whose father has been killed by a landmine. And he gets her almost all the way, and then she sees this shiny plastic thing, and she picks it up and dies. Batman fails to save this little girl.
Some landmine activists had hoped that the Batman graphic novel could be used as ammunition in a campaign to encourage the Senate to sign a treaty banning landmines, but the proposed treaty failed to pass on the Senate floor. Superheroes may have lost occasional battles in national politics, but they were nearly killed by the economic ups and downs of their own industry. At the start of the 90s, business boomed as investors saw comic books as a haven during the recession.
An influx of speculators came in, people who really weren't reading comics, they were just buying them as investments.
There were articles in the newspapers that comic books are a better investment than the stock market.
Stores marked up comics that were only weeks old and sold them for several times their cover prices. Speculators hoped they'd one day be worth as much as the collector's items from the 1940s.
And then the greed factor sort of set in with every publisher, where, they started producing alternate covers, special editions.
Sales went through the roof and into space.
Some books were selling like 6 million copies when there were only 500,000 readers. But these 500,000 readers were all, buying 2 and 3 and 4 editions of this particular book.
And because they were buying that many, the publishers were printing more and more and more copies.
You had a lot of adults and a lot of little kids who thought they were going to either get rich or put themselves through college on these books.
The only reason the old comics were going for a lot of money is they were rare. Nobody pays a lot of money for something that's all over the place. They were a glut on the market. When the fans started to try to sell the books they were saving and found they couldn't sell them, they stopped buying multiple copies. And suddenly the publishers were caught with these huge print runs.
We had a crash at the end of it we haven't seen to this day.
After 1993, thousands of comic stores closed. Hundreds of creators lost their jobs. By 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. Monthly sales fell from 48 million to 7 million.
The medium almost died. It really almost died.
To make matters worse, a potential new generation of readers had other distractions: the internet and electronic games. The industry limped through the late 90s with stunts like finally marrying off Superman and Lois Lane and electing the evil Lex Luthor president in 2000. Superheroes spent most of their time in the world of fantasy until the real world intruded one September morning.
We used New York as a backdrop for all our books. We had to do something.
Comic book superheroes had been rebels and vigilantes in the social turmoil of the Great Depression, and then patriotic soldiers in World War II. They reflected the unrest of Vietnam and Watergate. At the start of the 21st century, most characters were more violent, more cynical, more sexually active than ever before. In other words, they reflected their world, as popular culture always does.
Comic books have been around since the dawn of time. They just weren't put on paper, they were put on cave walls. The stories of the great hunt, of the great droughts, of the great famines. Superhero comics are just an extension of that.
But sometimes, comics have anticipated reality. No one could have imagined September 11th unless they'd read comic books.
Osama bin Laden's plan was to create so much chaos and so much destruction that there would be a general war, and that Islamic fundamentalist or Islamist movements would take over governments and countries, even the United States. And when I heard that, it sounded like a comic book plot. It sounded like something Dr. Doom would do, going to create chaos and take over the world. Unfortunately, the real world looks more like a comic book world than ever before.
No longer are, 2 110-story buildings falling to the ground the stuff of fantasy. We felt it in New York when it fell. I felt the ground tremble.
As the quintessential New York hero, it seemed only right that Spider-Man would be personally affected by the attacks.
This picture of Spider-Man looking at ground zero, it's compelling, it's emotional. He represents all of us.
Frank Miller was halfway through his futuristic sequel to Dark Knight Returns when the towers fell.
I just, had a flying Batmobile go into a skyscraper and blown up half a metropolis. So it was an awkward moment for me in DC Comics. Because I was drawing this story while I was breathing in the World Trade Center in my Manhattan home. I had to acknowledge it, and the only way I could do it was to have Superman in the wreckage of Metropolis, finding the locket of Lois Lane's and finding out that the love of his life was dead, and then move on.
Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and Image put out commemorative comics that raised millions of dollars for the 9/11 victims and their families. Jim Steranko created a fundraising poster that recalled the glory days of World War II, when the superheroes were enthusiastically united against a common enemy. 21st century comic books had none of that.
I think it would be too corny, and it would be in bad taste to have a cartoon figure punching a Muslim and saying, "We'll get you." No, that wouldn't work today, I think.
A superhero's job isn't mourning the dead, it's fighting evil. And when your name is Captain America and your country is attacked, you have to do something.
And it was the supervillain of the month that Cap would fight. And now the stories of Captain America are much more relevant. He's dealing with terrorism at home, terrorism abroad, making the book that much more relevant.
And yet Captain America suspects that his own government is hiding information about funneling weapons to terrorists. The World War II veteran is also haunted by parallels between 9/11 and the Allied firebombing of Dresden. That kind of political complexity is usually missing in action when superheroes leave the printed page for the mainstream media. Superhero adventures are often simplified on TV, in video games, and in movies. Nevertheless, with comic book sales dropping, those venues may be the superheroes' best hope for continued survival in the marketplace.
Every major motion picture studio and television network head is looking at comic books to find the next big franchisable.
But making a good superhero movie is tougher than it looks.
You know, I've seen Batman, I've seen Superman, Spider-Man, and I've seen Daredevil. Those movies are all wonderful on one level or another, but what they're missing is the characters' ability to internalize on a page, where you can read their thoughts and what's going through their mind.
Although they may be difficult to adapt, the fact that comic book characters and storylines are devoured by other media is a sure sign of the revered status comic books hold in pop culture.
The funny thing is now, the comic book is much more glamorous than having a newspaper strip.
Those of us working in the medium felt that we were working in a medium that was a despised art form, and indeed it was. We're at the cusp of acceptance as a valid art form.
But the respect comic books are now getting may be coming too late for the superheroes.
Comic book superheroes, in some ways, are more popular and more prevalent than they've ever been because of major motion pictures, video games, the internet, and so forth. And in other ways, you know, comic book sales of superheroes are at historic lows.
You went from easily being able to sell 1 million comic books to where the top-selling book in this industry to retailers is 150, 160,000.
To keep the industry going, publishers are exploring retail outlets beyond comic book stores.
While comic shops are always the core of our business, the fastest growing area is bookstores. The graphic novel and the collections that become graphic novels are really the future.
And of course, there's the internet.
Over the next 20 years, there will be more and more cartooning delivered online.
It'll never be as pleasant to read something on a screen as it is to hold it in your hand, to turn those pages and turn back.
We all love paper, don't get me wrong. But I think that electronic comics are really the way of the future.
Will superheroes be part of that future?
The ones that work are archetypes, made by people who believed and cared. Batman will still be around in 100 years' time.
I see a bright future for tights, precisely because it's the one genre that was created by comic books.
Comic book writers and artists are doing the same thing that storytellers did, drawing the pictures on the caves at Lascaux. We're using story to create context for life. On a very, very good day, and we don't have enough of them, that becomes art. On an ordinary day, it becomes escape. It's always magic.
Superheroes endure because they represent basic American beliefs. that there are choices to make between good and evil, that individuals can make a difference in society and history.
Superheroes have come a long way since their first flight. At times it's been a bumpy ride, but the comics and the characters have been equal to the task. There's something so enduring in what superheroes represent, the choice between good and evil, the power of an individual to make a difference in society and history. To find out more about your favorite superhero, visit your local comic book store. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Wilson. Thanks for watching.
In my opinion, it's mostly just stories to scare children. Started back in the 1700s. The stories began circulating, supposedly, as I understand, about a witch in the area, some old woman that was cursing people, that was doing things. I don't know all that, but she became the witch of the area. As I understand, she might even have been put to death over it. Years progressed from there. Every bad thing that happened to the town, it was the Blair Witch causing. You know, people just have to find something to tag, someone to label as the cause of things. The Blair Witch became that for this area, for Burketsville. Quite some time again after that, a child drowned in the river, but there were claims supposedly that the child was seen being pulled down by a hand in the river. The fact, as far as her drowning in shallow water, I mean, I know people have drowned in soup bowls. So you can't tell me that 8 inches of water is not too shallow for someone to drown in. A child did go missing after the child drowned, a young boy, I believe. A search party went out looking for the young boy. Young boy was recovered. The search party never came back. So they sent out a search party for the search party, and they came across the bodies found on Coffin Rock right by the river, and there every member of the search party was dead. They were not just dead, they were mutilated, they were hacked to pieces. I'm not denying that that ever happened. That's a fact. That happened, but it got attributed to the Blair Witch, and I don't see how that happened. There was the Rustin Parr incident, which became attributed to the Blair Witch in some way or another, because Rustin Parr claimed that he did what he did because an old woman told him to, or the old witch. It's been said in different ways. The most recent incident that we've had happen is these 3 college kids went out into the woods in the Burketsville area. They were going to make themselves a documentary concerning the Blair Witch. And they went missing, and they were assumed dead, and then sometime later, their equipment was found. They pieced together the material found. There were a lot of videotapes, some film reels and stuff, and they managed to piece this together in what they think implies that the Blair Witch attacked them and killed them. These kids aren't missing. They aren't dead. This is just a sick joke. That's the kind of stuff that sad, sick people perform on these kind of events. That's the Blair Witch legend.
How long have you been here? How long have you been in here?
You know, he was the boogeyman for the area. We were always told, you know, don't do that, Rustin Parr is going to get you. Go to sleep and be quiet, or Rustin Parr is going to get you. Well, this is my collection of cameras, predominantly Super 8, 16 millimeter here. This is the camera that I got from my parents, though. It used to have a viewfinder on it. I think they had a gun in. Well, basically, I've been working in film all my life. A projector that I've used for years, not in Hollywood, not making it as a filmmaker, but yeah, it has some stuff that, well, probably has not seen too many eyes. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, we got it. We got it right here. This is my Rustin Parr treasure box. Well, initially it wasn't just Rustin Parr. I just kind of always had a fascination with serial killers. Convicted murderer Rustin Parr executed for Burketsville killings. Transcripts from the trial. Here's Rustin giving his testimony. I mean, that was just one of one of the few times I had someone like that, a serial killer of that repute, that was like in my own backyard, that I could possibly find something out myself.
Why did you do it, Mr. Farr? I heard voices in my head. Whose voice, Mr. Farr? No idea who it was. Was it Satan, Mr. Farr? Was it the Blair Witch, Mr. Farr? Could have been.
I'm Bill Barnes, the Executive Director of the Burketsville Historical Society and the historian of Burketsville. It's my responsibility there to teach the children the history of our area, because we're right close to three larger towns, Rockville, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., which are all fairly historical. But I don't want to lose touch with the fact that we have a pretty good historical town, too. Let's go back, say, to the fall of 1940. And then Burketsville being a small town, everybody knew everybody, usually most of them by their first name. But we had some kids disappearing in town. And they were mostly between the ages of 6 and 8. It wasn't long after that, and Mr. Parr came into town and walked in Mr. Smith or Mr. Stryker's store. I don't know which one of the general stores, depending on who was telling the story as to where he went. But he come in and he said the words that has become famous in Burketsville, is that I have finally finished. Well, they didn't know what he meant. And they asked him. He said, I've killed those children.
Mr. Farr, how did you get the children into the woods? Promised them things. What kind of things, Mr. Farr? Candy.
He was charged and convicted with the abduction of 8 children and the murder of 7 children in that area.
They could kill other children that we don't know about, Mr. Farr. Over here, Mr. Farr.
Rustin was basically, up until that point, he was a pretty harmless guy. He was friendly, he was nice. All of a sudden, he became this monster, the demon of Burketsville, as they referred to him at times.
How did you kill the children, Mr. Farr? With knives. Mr. Farr, were you alone in the killings? Yes.
He was very uncomfortable in society, and society was very uncomfortable with him. When he was arrested for killing 7 children in Burketsville, I was serving that prison. I heard his confession, which I have kept as a private vow for, 50 years now.
Mr. Farr, why those 7 children? That's what the voices told me.
I'm finally finished. Those were the words that are attributed to him. I have asked around to anyone who might have been a survivor of that time. I can't find anybody who is willing to say they know that Rustin Parr said those words. I'm finally finished.
Said, I'm finally finished. And that was his acceptance of death, I think. It had nothing to do with the crime. Everybody said, but I don't think it had anything to do with the crime.
So they got the sheriff, come down, and he arrested him. And he went up to the cabin, and sure enough, he found 7 bodies. Not 8, but 7. And the 8th one that he didn't find was Kyle Brody.
While they were looking for the bodies in the home and uncovering those bodies, Kyle Brody comes walking back into the town of Burketsville, and he starts telling people about Rustin Parr and what Rustin Parr has been doing for the last year. How Rustin Parr held him captive there in his home. How Rustin Parr was committing these horrible, unspeakable acts to these children.
But he came back in town. He testified against him at the trial.
You know, I do not know why they took me to that trial. I mean, what were they thinking? Taking a child my age to hear someone testify about killings and murders, and there were all these people, they were all around. I just remember there were so many people all around, and they were staring at Kyle. And I remember, I guess it was the judge banging, and I remember Kyle sitting in this big box, just staring straight ahead, not looking at anyone. And those eyes of his just looking straight ahead and answering these questions.
He begins telling everyone what happened to him over this time, that he's been locked into Rustin Parr's home, into one of the rooms in the upstairs, and periodically he would be brought out by Rustin Parr, who then, according to Kyle Brody, Rustin Parr would face him into a corner, while Rustin Parr then performed these atrocities on these children.
And I just remember Kyle's face all white and pale, and his eyes all blue-gray, and Almost as though he didn't want to see what he had seen, he didn't want to say what he was about to say, he didn't want to know what he had come to know.
He had details about Emily Holland's abduction. Emily Holland was abducted an entire 2 weeks before Kyle Brody went missing. And yet he knows events about the abduction, about where Parr found her in the woods and abducted her and brought her back to his place.
Now, justice being real swift, they took him down in Rockville, behind the jail where the gallows was, and hung him.
He seemed to get some pleasure from telling them the stories they wanted to hear. And they would have hung him anyway.
I think that the decision was made that Rustin Parr was guilty before anybody had a chance to even look at the facts. It was all decided as they were marching up the hills to Rustin Parr's home. And then with the boy coming in at the same time and laying out his story, by the time they came back with what they were looking at as conclusive evidence, it was done. Here's one on a young Parr victim put in institution. Living Parr victim leading difficult life. Poor Kyle suffering. There's Kyle Brody, one of his many trips before the law.
And we had a boy there in town named Kyle Brody. Kyle was a weird sort of a kid. And being like he was, some of the things he liked to do was he'd like to catch cats and stuff them in a mailbox.
But Kyle Brody, when we first saw him, I determined almost immediately that he belonged away from society. He belonged in a mental institution. He was obviously mentally ill.
I remember I used to see him outside playing by the stream all the time.
The classic tearing wings off of flies, that's nothing, but he would also take the frogs out of the river. He'd capture them and he would chop the legs off of the frogs. He wouldn't kill the frogs first.
Children who've been abused, they sometimes take things out on small animals or insects. They say that's the first sign of a psychological disturbance in a child.
He believed that he was severely physically beaten as a child by his father.
My father wanted Kyle to be a man, and he disciplined him very harshly at times.
There's history of the boy being a problem child, a very difficult child to deal with. When he disappeared, the parents thought he had run away. So they were rather surprised when he came back with his story of being abducted.
My brother was forced to stand facing a wall while other children were killed behind him. He could hear the sounds. He could hear them screaming.
The 7 children that died, none of these children knew every one of the other children that were missing. The only person out of the entire group that did know all 8 of the children abducted was Kyle Brody.
But he liked to fight. He'd always fight with the other kids. And he didn't care how big they was. He'd jump on and fight with them.
He had past histories with them, some of them troubled past. There's some records, not records, but knowledge of, from the people I've talked to, of there being disturbances between Kyle and some of the other kids.
And one day he tried to pick a fight with me, but I never thought nothing about fighting.
Kyle Brody was involved with the abduction of Emily Holland, hence he knows all these facts and details about it. Rustin Parr had never threatened anyone in any way. He was a peaceful person. This kid had it in him to develop these ideas, these schemes, these plans, and I think that he is the one who led Rustin Parr through every one of these things. I don't think he stood there with his face facing a corner during all this. I think he was there taking Rustin Parr's hand, putting the knife in it, and having him do this, because he would need someone with the strength of an adult to do some of these acts, but he was the one that was making the decisions, and he was the one guiding Rustin Parr through this.
I met Kyle Brody in the late 60s when I was assigned to the psychiatric ward of the Maryland State Institute for the Criminally Insane. I'd heard about him before I got there because he was quite infamous, and his case made quite a number of newspapers.
He was a legendary, dark figure in the hospital. He was this last incarcerated link to this heinous multiple murder that had taken place in 1940.
Kyle Brody's pharmacological chart was all over the place when I first met him. They tried everything probably known to man, and nothing was working. And I read that, and I just, this has got to stop.
I mean, these medications are so potent. The side effects are unspeakable.
The medication I had originally suggested, he finally agreed, yes, we both agreed, let's try that. We did, and there were some noticeable changes. Then I noticed he had changed. He was back again. And I found out later that Dr. Hall had switched the medication without consulting with me.
I told Mom and Dad, and I said we had to get him out of there. But they couldn't afford to.
Kyle Brody's sister, I guess you could say, was one of the many thorns in the side of a system that was already full of thorns. She was convinced that her brother was not insane, and did everything to the best of her ability to keep him out of a mental institution.
Kyle Brody, I'm not going to say that he had an easy existence after the Rustin Parr trial, but I mean, certainly, I think it's better than being hung. But he became a rather aggressive panhandler where it wasn't really an option for people to walk away and not give him something. He also had incidents of shoplifting. He has robberies, not armed robberies, but very violent, aggressive things. So he tended to spend most of his time in a couple of different institutions, and that's actually where he died as well.
What does that mean?
I'm not seeing anything. I have nothing to base my opinions of the adult Kyle Brody on until I hear about this film called White Enamel.
I don't call them documentaries. I don't like the term documentary very much. It conjures up something stale and boring to most people. So I call them nonfiction films.
White Enamel was a documentary, a black and white documentary shot back in the 60s in in insane asylums in Maryland. They tend to center on one in particular, which, wonder of wonders, is the very same institution that Kyle Brody spent a great deal of time at.
I don't like it here.
I think I expected a certain thing when I went into the hospital there, and it was completely different than I thought. And I took a deep breath and I jumped off the cliff. I let it happen as it was happening.
Glory, Nixon. I should be a Vietnam. I could be a general. I mean, yeah, I could. But no, Nixon and Kissinger, they don't want to share no glory at all. My father was in World War II. He was a gunner's mate on the USS Idaho, and I'm here because of Richard Milhouse Nixon and Mr. Kissinger. I am here. They're hearing right now what I'm saying. They don't fool me. They're hearing what I'm saying. The mailman was bugging, yeah. He's just not looking at our mail. He's bugging this whole place.
So how long have you been in here? How long have you been in here?
I've been here a long time. A lot of years.
Years? Why are you in here?
I don't know why. They said, they told me.
I asked David Hooper about that, how he made the decision to do that. I knew he thought it was powerful. He had no idea how powerful it was going to be, but he knew he had to say something about how humankind in general can treat the unwanted, and how this culture is a beautiful culture and doesn't tolerate what's ugly. And so that as this frame after frame after frame starts to stack up, at first you think, oh man, I just don't want to watch this. It's too tedious, beyond words. And then all of a sudden you go, this would be very hard to live with. This would be a very difficult job to have. Who gets this job? Who wants this job? What are the families of the people who treat these people this way? Whose dad shoves a tube down some guy's nose and pours lunch into their stomach. No. And what's the kid like that lives in that family? How far out do the ripples of this go? And all of a sudden, questions are being asked without you even knowing them, because there is no linear context to this film, because it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a beginning, middle, and end at all times. So it is a life force that's coming at you, not a tidy picture.
White enamel is a, well, it was a very exciting point for me. I mean, the film itself is an interesting film as far as the information you can glean from it as to how inmates are treated in insane asylums. That's interesting, but I'm not really that interested in that. There is actually about 5 minutes worth of footage, approximately, of Kyle Brody as an adult. There is a scene of Kyle Brody in his cell, and he's chanting something. And what he's chanting is the phrase, a two-word phrase, never given.
Never given. Never given.
What does that mean?
Never given, never given, never given. He's chanting that. And what this means, the importance to this, is there's actual reported fact from the guards that watched over Rustin Parr on a suicide watch while he was waiting to be killed. They have reports of Rustin Parr screaming the words, never given. The same two words, never given. I don't know what the phrase means, never given, but here is another connection. Rustin Parr is chanting never given, or screaming it never given. Kyle Brody is chanting it in his cell. Now, I didn't stop there. I know enough about filmmaking to know that if you have less than 5 minutes of Kyle Brody in your film, there could probably be another, maybe an hour's worth of footage of Kyle Brody that was never put into the film. Filmmakers overshoot. So I began to look for David Hooper. He was very forthcoming with information. He did remember Kyle Brody. Kyle Brody made quite an impression on him. He's in the film, he's a very intense figure. And then he told me that he had other footage of Kyle Brody.
Chris is a maniac, and I recognize myself at the same age. It takes breast balls to do some of the stuff that he's doing.
I begged, I pleaded, I cajoled, I bribed, everything I could, and he was willing to send me the extra footage that he had. The stuff was a mess. I did everything I could to restore this before I even began to look at it, built it up into the best shape I could, watched this stuff, and there I found another very interesting key. There was a shot in this rec room of this insane asylum, and Kyle Brody is there with this large art notepad, and he's writing on the notepad. And what is being written on that notepad, being written from right to left, the way it is supposed to be written, is transitus fluvii, the language, the witchcraft language. No, this is not a common language. It's not known all around the world. Very few people know this. And here is Kyle Brody, to the best of my knowledge, that is what he's writing in, is transitus fluvii. I took this footage and I took whatever stills I could grab from it and tried to find people who could substantiate this.
Chris Carrasco found me through my website. And he, sent me an email, and it said, I have this piece of footage from the late 60s, and I need you to analyze it and take a look at it. He wanted me to figure out and analyze what this particular gentleman was drawing, and he was convinced that I could do it. And I was equally convinced that there was no way that you could conclusively say what this individual was drawing.
And she got some improvements, but she could not verify for sure from what she found that it was what I was hoping, the transitus fluvii. I found another woman, a Kendra Feynman, who actually is relatively fluent in this.
Chris brought that to me and asked if I could tell him what that was. So after examining that footage, we determined that this gentleman actually was writing in transitus fluvii. You can see very clearly the little circle embellishments at the end, the little loops at the end of the letters.
And she looked at this, and she fairly quickly was able to decide that this was transitus fluvii.
And that language was mostly really used in secret societies and cults and different sects and with witches that lived and practiced in Europe.
And this is what Kyle Brody is writing from right to left, the way transitus fluvii is written as if as in the Hebrew language.
They're saying that there are occult alphabets, or you know, they can tell what they're writing because that's what they want to believe. That's their theory. And so that's what they're bearing out.
I saw him writing, I saw how he was writing, and I, based on my own knowledge of a language, could decipher those characters.
You cannot start with a theory and then look for it in the photograph. You have to take the photograph or the piece of film as a separate entity, analyze it on its merits alone. Then if there's some correspondence with the theorem, then great. But if there isn't, you need to let it go.
Now, this is the exact same language that we find on the walls of the upstairs of Rustin Parr's home. Transitus fluvii, written by this kid who has a high IQ and might have somehow picked this up at some stage in his life as compared to the possibility of Rustin Parr, a man who was illiterate, could not read or write at all in English. The idea of him writing transitus fluvii language all over the walls of his home, it's absurd. And this child, this magnetic, charming child of Kyle Brody, who I think has manipulated Rustin Parr, made him do his bidding, if not actually holding his hand and leading him to it, directing him still through every action, through the abduction of Emily Hollins, which Kyle Brody should not have known anything about, but he did, to all the actions of each of the deaths within the basement of that house. I think it was Kyle Brody leading him through this. Now, this story of what happened in Rustin Parr's cabin is being told by an unreliable witness who is insane, who is also the person, in my opinion, responsible for every one of the murders. These are things that once you start putting them together, once you start thinking of all the facts, it'll shake your beliefs in everything that you know so far.
One short time ago, there was a guy from Ohio started researching the death of those 7 children. And he came up with a theory that nobody else had ever come up with, that Mr. Parr did not kill those children, that Kyle Brody was actually the murderer.
Rustin Parr was tired of living in the way he was living. But I guess I've told you something of what he told me in confession. But he told me that he had killed no one. Not just me, he told his God that he had killed no one. And I asked him, I said, well, let me go to the judge with this story. Let me tell the people. And he said, no, this is my confession. You have no right to take it anywhere.
Kyle Brody wasn't any older than the kids that got killed. He was just a kid himself. He was mean, that's true. But I don't think he ever had the stomach to kill those kids.
Well, searching for the truth is not an easy thing. It's not something that most people want to face. I have generally found that once people set their minds on what has happened, if you start offering them any sort of alternate idea, especially if it's something that really goes against this happy world that they've set up for themselves, you become hated for it.
Chris Carrasco is a blooming fucking idiot. He's just some bozo who's trying to drum up publicity for himself with this preposterous hypothesis about a very inflammatory subject anyway.
Well, you can make what you want of it. I don't tell you that this is absolutely what happened, that this is the only way it could happen, that this is God's honest truth. I'm not saying that. All I'm offering you is my viewpoint on it.
Kyle was simply incapable of doing violence to someone else. I mean, finally, he did violence to himself.
I've looked at everything with an open mind. I did not set myself on anything, and I've gotten every fact I could, and then I put them together into a hypothesis. Now, you tell me anyone else that does it. You introduce them to me, you show me their material, and then I'll be happy to change my opinion. Nobody else has done the work I've done. You're welcome to go off and think whatever you want. I'm not telling you what to think, but this is what I've come to, and this is a conclusion I found. That's it. I've never felt that I've gone overboard on this, and once you start looking into this and getting a glimmer of what's going on here, I find it really hard to turn myself away, and it amazes me that these other people don't want to find out more about this.
He's creating pain for these parents, and he's taking my brother's name in vain, to put it mildly.
It's a human tendency to let sleeping dogs lie, but his instincts are right. It takes one to know one, and this guy has a reason and a need for finding this stuff out, and if I can help him, I'm happy to do it.
I have gone to Burketsville trying to open up information on this, trying to get new ideas, trying to interview some people. They're not interested. It took quite some prying to get some people to open up at all. Some people never will. You're trying to burst everyone's illusions, and people don't take kindly to that. But if you care about what you're doing, if you believe in what you're doing, if you think you have a shred of the truth in your hands, you want to fill the hand up. You just want to get more. You need more information. You need to find more, and you hope to get the truth out in the light of day.